By the way, it seems that Paul's only junior had been complaining to others about how poor his leadership was, to the point that he couldn't even consider him a boss. Paul overheard this, and they are currently in the midst of a dispute. He should have known how important it is to take care of your own junior. As for me, I had been offered a position at our overseas headquarters. I had been declining due to the current circumstances and out of consideration for Paul. But I finally decided to take on the opportunity. I'm currently preparing for my transition. I've been causing my father some worry, but we've started practicing video calls so we can keep in touch when I'm abroad. I am content because I'll be able to pursue the job that I have been dreaming of since I was a child. It's time to give it my all. Paul hardly ever helped with household chores, but Michelle didn't mind. When they went out together, Paul always took charge, letting Michelle relax and enjoy herself without any worries. It felt like they had a good balance in their relationship. However, everything changed when Michelle's mother passed away. While Michelle was at work, her father called to tell her that her mother's health had gotten worse and she had collapsed. Michelle rushed to the hospital and said her final goodbye to her mother. She decided to stay with her father to arrange the funeral. When she called Paul, he said he couldn't leave work suddenly. He missed the wake and only made it to the funeral, but it seemed like he hadn't prepared to dress appropriately for the occasion. I had to quickly find him clothes to wear, but he complained a lot, saying I should have done it earlier. With all the sadness and business of arranging the funeral, I couldn't handle Paul's complaints, so I ignored them. But he didn't seem to appreciate that and stayed in a bad mood. Since then, it feels like we've been arguing more in our marriage. It's normal to have disagreements after being married for 3 years, but lately, Paul has been picking fights aggressively. He's always telling me what to do and taking charge. I got tired of it and tried saying no a few times, but he didn't know where things were in the house. So simple tasks took a long time. Plus, he complained while trying to help, making an even bigger mess. Eventually, I realized it's easier if I just do everything myself. I didn't always do everything Paul asked. I handled some things myself to make my life easier. I mentioned preparing for my mom's first death anniversary gathering next week. Okay, I said, and Paul grumbled, "Oh, I have an important meeting that day. What should I do? I've told you about this gathering well ahead of time." How could he suddenly say he couldn't make it? What? You're not coming? Paul let out a heavy sigh. It's not that, but it'll be hard to leave everything to my subordinates, you know. He seemed pleased with his recent promotion and often talked about his junior team members. I felt like sighing right along with him. Please make arrangements for it, all right? I stressed. It was the day before my mom's first death anniversary gathering. When I returned home from work, Paul was sulking in the living room, drinking beer. "Sorry, I'm late. Had to do overtime," he mumbled. I figured he was upset because I was late, delaying dinner. I've been waiting here for an hour, just as I expected, but it's only an hour, right? If he couldn't cook, he could have bought something. I did tell him when I'd be home. He could have taken some initiative. Holding back my frustration, I handed him a takeout box. I thought cooking would take too long, so I got this on my way home. In response, Paul slammed his beer glass on the table. "Takeout again? Aren't you slacking off a bit too much lately? The last time I got takeout was about 2 weeks ago. Sure, I've been busy, and maybe I haven't been cooking every day, but still, I make sure to eat balanced meals and avoid relying on packaged food too much. Even though I don't think I deserve criticism, as I debated whether to respond, Paul, misunderstanding, added insult to injury. Can't argue when it's true, huh? Do your chores properly. You've been coming home late and claiming overtime. Maybe you're out cheating." Paul's words ignited the resentment I've been feeling. If you know I'm working late, the least you could do is make dinner. You don't have to cook. Picking up takeout isn't that hard. I always tell you when I'll be late, and even with my busy schedule, I handle all the household chores. There's no need for that attitude. Paul glared at me. "You're 3 years older, remember? I could have married a younger woman, but I chose you," Paul said, expecting gratitude and obedience. "You should be thankful and listen to me. No one else would want you, so you'd be in trouble if I left, right?" Did he really just say that? I was furious and couldn't hold back. If you wanted a younger woman, you should have married one before we got together. I asked if you were okay with me being older, and you said yes. That's why we got married. Even without you, I can manage my life. Paul laughed mockingly. "Fine, let's get a divorce." With that, he grabbed his beer and takeout and went to his room. We've argued before, but this was different. I was done with him. I decided to eat my takeout to calm down. Maybe he was just hungry and annoyed, I thought as I ate, but I couldn't shake the disbelief that this was happening the day before my mom's death anniversary. After a while, I called out to Paul from outside his room. "We need to leave by 8 a.m. tomorrow, so I'll wake you up around 7. There was no response, but I felt he was awake. With that said, I went to bed. The next morning, when I woke up early, Paul was already gone. The bags I packed were still in the room. He hadn't left for the gathering without me. Where did he go? I called his phone, but he didn't pick up. He didn't respond to my texts either. With no other option, I left a voicemail and started getting ready to leave alone. I finally reached Paul while waiting for the train at the station. "I have a meeting. Can't leave it to my juniors," was all he said before the call ended abruptly. I was overwhelmed with a mix of anger and resignation, feeling stunned and bewildered. Before I could dwell on it further, the train arrived, burdened with luggage meant for two. I boarded alone. Upon reaching my father's house, he asked anxiously, "Where's Paul?" Seeing my father's sadness since my mother's passing, I didn't want to add to his worries. Taking a deep breath, I forced a smile and replied, "Sorry, he got called into an important meeting. He was supposed to come, but with his recent promotion, it sounded crucial, so I encouraged him to prioritize it." My father nodded in understanding. "I understand. He's working hard. It's disappointing not to see him, but your mother would understand. Let him know he's always welcome here." His words stung a bit, but I maintained my smile throughout the day. With no word from Paul and the night growing late, I didn't reach out to him either. Planning to stay the night and return home the next day as planned, I saw no need to contact him. Though it felt childish, I thought about making him his favorite dish, hamburgers, tomorrow. With that in mind, I went to bed. The next day, I left my father's house and got home around noon. Before going grocery shopping, I wanted to drop off my bags. As I entered the living room, I saw Paul had left dirty laundry lying around, as usual. I sighed, thinking he still hadn't learned how to use the washing machine, and tossed his laundry in with mine. Taking a break and returning to the living room, I noticed something on the table. As I got closer, I couldn't believe what I saw: divorce papers already signed by him. "Why?" I stared at the papers in disbelief. Was this his way of asking for a divorce? I grabbed my phone from my bag. It should be Paul's lunch break. I wasn't sure if he'd answer, but to my surprise, he did. As soon as I called, I asked, "What's the meaning of these divorce papers?" Paul laughed and replied, "What's there to question? It's exactly what it seems. I don't want an older wife who won't handle household chores. That's why I want a divorce. If we split, I can find a younger wife. After all, a wife is like a status symbol, right? I can't boast about you because you're older. It's tough when my team asks about you, and avoiding the topic isn't easy." I was speechless, unable to respond. "If you want to avoid a divorce, start doing your chores properly. I'll be home as usual today, so make sure to get some beer, all right? If you disagree, take the divorce papers to court. It's your call." With that, he hung up, leaving me in shock, unable to utter a word. Paul probably assumed I'd comply if he said that. I only did the chores because I disliked having to ask or beg him. He must have believed I did it to keep him from leaving me. Perhaps he thought I wouldn't stand up to him because he's the dominant one. Being married to a younger husband might seem glamorous to some, but in reality, there's nothing remarkable about it. I often emphasized his youth, but in truth, he's average in looks, personality, and income. There's nothing particularly special about him. Labeling him as younger was simply convenient. When we married, I worried about the age gap, but now that we're both in our 30s and he's just 3 years younger, it doesn't seem significant. If there were a larger age difference between us, perhaps I feel differently. It's disheartening to constantly be labeled as the older wife when we're practically the same age. Determined to take action, I grabbed my bag and headed straight to the family court. Submitting the divorce papers brought a sense of relief, signaling the end of our relationship. I realized I could live without Paul. With newfound freedom, I felt lighter and decided to request a few days of paid leave from my boss. Luckily, work had just slowed down, and he granted me a week off. Now divorced, I needed to organize my belongings. With minimal possessions, cleaning up was a breeze. I stored larger items in a storage unit, packed essentials and clothes in my car, and spontaneously decided to visit a hot spring resort. Since it was the off-season, I found a cheap hotel for my stay without any hassle. Driving with excitement, I indulged in the hot springs and relaxed in my room, only to be interrupted by a ringing phone. "Michelle, I asked you to get beer, didn't I? Where are you?" It was Paul's usual time to return home. I chuckled, recalling his words. "I'm at a hot spring resort." "What? A hot spring resort? Why? What's going on?" "Didn't you say to file the divorce papers if I didn't agree with you?" I pictured my ex-husband flustered, and my laughter grew. "Wait, did you really file them?" "Yes, I did." "Why?" "It was your suggestion, Paul." "Have you forgotten what you said earlier?" His tone became perturbed. "Wait, are you joking? When you say hot spring resort, do you mean some nearby spa?" "If so, I'll get dinner, so come home soon." I couldn't help but laugh at the sudden, seemingly caring tone as he claimed to be a considerate husband. It took about an hour and a half of driving. There's even an outdoor natural hot spring. It's so relaxing. I hope it doesn't rain tomorrow. Since you're going to get your own dinner, I've already packed my things so you won't have to worry about me coming back. Take care of yourself. Paul begged me to return, but I had no intention of going back. You're the one who initiated the divorce. Have you forgotten? It was obvious you were using divorce as a threat to control me. I told you, I can manage without you. Now that you've divorced your older wife, go find a younger one. Whether you can or not, I don't know. Paul fell silent. It's none of my business, but you should consider moving out of that apartment too. Finally, Paul spoke again. Why should I? His voice was barely audible. Think about your income. You'll go broke soon if you keep living there. You can't clean, do laundry, or cook. You'll need housekeeping and dining out, right? That costs money. It would be a problem if most of your salary went into rent. You thought you were the provider, but my salary is nearly double yours. You never provided for me. If anything, it was the other way around. Also, you were overconfident just because of one junior. But did you know I have multiple juniors under me and even more under them? I don't usually talk about work because Paul gets moody, but I outrank him in both position and salary. You'd think he'd notice after living together, but it seemed like he was fine finding out now. Perhaps Paul, being dominant and proud, kept his ego intact by looking down on me. Now that he can't, he must feel defeated. I've shattered his pride as payback for all these years. The reason I handled household chores without complaining, despite your domineering behavior, was partly because you were younger and I cut you some slack, and partly because it was too much hassle to ask you for anything. It's not like I needed you to stay with me. I was just taking care of your needs along with mine. So when you said, do the chores or we divorce, of course I chose divorce. We're strangers now. Goodbye then. I said what I needed to and hung up. Feeling refreshed, I savored the hotel's food afterward. As expected, Paul sought reconciliation, but I replied with a smile. I'm older than you. I'm sure you don't want me back. Presumably, he wasn't successful with younger women. Eventually, Paul gave up and moved out of the apartment. I hired a lawyer for the division of assets, demanding more to compensate for the burden of household chores imposed on me until now. Paul, being cheap, didn't hire a lawyer, so I had the upper hand. With my lawyer, we reached an agreement with favorable conditions for me. By the way, it seems Paul's only junior had been complaining to others about his poor leadership, to the extent that he couldn't even see him as a boss. Paul overheard this, and they're currently in dispute. He should have realized how crucial it is to support your own junior. As for me, I've been offered a position at our overseas headquarters. I initially declined due to the current circumstances and out of consideration for Paul. But I finally decided to seize the opportunity. I'm now preparing for my transition. Though I've caused my father some worry, we've started practicing video calls to stay connected when I'm abroad. I'm content knowing I'll be pursuing the job I've dreamt of since childhood. It's time to give it my all.
The quaint little gift shop was a hive of activity, its narrow aisles teeming with last-minute shoppers. The air was thick with the scent of scented candles and fresh stationery. I was there too, meandering through the shelves, my eyes skimming over quirky mugs and vintage clocks, searching for a unique keepsake. That's when I noticed him, a lone figure amidst the chaos, looking utterly perplexed and out of his element. He was standing in front of the greeting cards, flipping a card open and then snapping it shut, his brows knitted in concentration. A small, peculiar trinket dangled from his other hand. He seemed to be debating with himself, lost in a world of indecision. I couldn't resist. I took a few steps towards him and said, "Can't make up your mind?" He looked up, slightly startled by the intrusion. His eyes, a deep shade of brown, met mine, and for a moment, he seemed to forget his predicament. "Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm in a bit of a bind here. I'm James," he said, offering a hand. "I'm Anna," I replied, shaking his hand. It was a firm handshake, confident yet inviting. "Nice to meet you, Anna. I'm on a mission to find the perfect birthday gift for my mom, but I seem to be circling around these two," he confessed, holding up the card and the trinket for me to see. The card was bright and colorful, with a humorous quip on the front. The trinket, on the other hand, was a small, intricately designed figurine, delicate and refined. I chuckled. Well, they're quite different. What's your mom like? Maybe I can help you choose. James's face lit up with a grateful smile. That would be amazing, thank you. My mom, she's incredible. She's got this sharp wit but also appreciates the finer things. She's been my rock, you know? As he spoke about his mother, his respect and love for her were palpable. It was touching to see a son speak so fondly of his mother. Well, it sounds like she's a woman of depth. How about we find something that celebrates both her sharp wit and her elegant taste? I suggested. We spent the next few minutes discussing his mother's likes and dislikes, her hobbies, and her style. The more we talked, the more I realized how easy and natural it felt to converse with James. He had a way of making every topic interesting and every joke funnier. Eventually, we settled on a beautiful pendant that was both elegant and quirky. It was a small, silver piece with an intricate design, but the centerpiece was a tiny, whimsical figure that seemed to dance in the light. Anna, you're a lifesaver. I would have been lost in here for hours without your help. How can I thank you? James said, his relief evident. How about you save me from having to cook dinner tonight? I joked, half hoping he'd take the bait. James's eyes twinkled with amusement. Dinner it is. There's this cozy little Italian place I know. How does that sound? It sounds perfect, I replied, my heart skipping a beat. We exchanged numbers and made plans to meet up for dinner. As I left the shop, the pendant securely in James's bag, I couldn't help but feel a flutter of excitement. In a sea of mundane days, this chance encounter felt like a breath of fresh air. The evening air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the end of summer and the start of something new. I stood outside James's parents' house, my palms sweaty, rehearsing my greeting. Nice to meet you. I practiced under my breath, trying to sound confident, not realizing that no amount of rehearsal could prepare me for the Carters. James opened the door with that familiar, warm smile. Ready? He asked, sensing my nervousness. As I'll ever be, I replied, trying to muster a smile. We stepped into the living room, and that's when I saw her, Mrs. Carter. She sat regally in her armchair, her cane resting against her leg, her eyes scrutinizing me like a hawk. Mr. Carter sat beside her, a silent, almost invisible presence. Mom, Dad, this is Anna, James introduced. Nice to meet you, I said, extending my hand. Mrs. Carter looked at my hand and then at me, her gaze piercing. Sit, dear, she said, her voice firm, ignoring my hand. We sat, and an uncomfortable silence filled the room. I could feel Mrs. Carter's eyes on me, examining, judging. James seemed oblivious to the tension, or maybe he was just used to it. So, Anna, Mrs. Carter began, her tone casual yet loaded. James tells us you're an accountant. That must be interesting. Yes, it's quite rewarding. I love working with numbers, finding solutions, I replied, trying to sound upbeat. she hummed, unimpressed. And your parents, what do they do? I explained, but with each answer, her questions grew more personal, more probing. It felt less like a conversation and more like an interrogation. James remained silent, his occasional attempts to change the subject quickly overridden by his mother's pointed questions. Tell me, Anna, how much do you earn? Mrs. Carter asked, her tone casual but her intent clear. I was taken aback. It wasn't a question you'd expect in a first meeting, and certainly not in such a straightforward manner. I glanced at James, hoping for some support, but he avoided my gaze. It's a decent amount. It allows me to live comfortably, I answered vaguely, feeling my cheeks flush. I see. And this house of yours, you live there alone? She continued, her curiosity unabashed. It was my grandmother's. I inherited it, I replied, feeling more like I was in a job interview than meeting my boyfriend's parents. Mrs. Carter nodded, her expression unreadable. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of discomfort. Mr. Carter remained silent, his presence almost ghost-like, while Mrs. Carter's questions lingered in the air, sharp and unnerving. As we left, James seemed pleased. That went well, don't you think? He said, oblivious to the undercurrents. Sure, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. As we drove away, the weight of the evening settled on my shoulders. Mrs. Carter's intense scrutiny and pointed questions lingered in my mind, a stark contrast to the warmth and ease I felt with James. James and I, we were in love, sure, but marriage wasn't on my immediate bingo card. Yet, there we were, standing in my living room, the same one I grew up in, talking about forever. Anna, I know it's soon, but I feel it, you know? Why wait? James said, his eyes full of that earnestness that first drew me to him. I hesitated, the image of Mrs. Carter's scrutinizing gaze flashing in my mind. James, your mom, that dinner was intense. Are you sure we're ready for this step? He took my hands in his, a comforting warmth spreading through me. Anna, I love you. And yeah, my mom can be a bit much, but don't worry, we'll handle it together. You and me, okay? His words were a balm, soothing away the doubts. Okay, I whispered, the word a leap of faith. We decided on a simple ceremony. No grand gestures, no elaborate fanfare, just an intimate gathering of close friends and family. It felt right, true to who we were. But as the day approached, the butterflies in my stomach weren't just from bridal jitters. The wedding was beautiful, a small affair in my backyard. The same trees that witnessed my childhood games now stood witness to my vows. But amidst the joy, there was an undercurrent of tension, an unspoken question hanging in the air: how would the Carters fit into this new picture we were painting? James sensed it, I could tell. As we danced, his hand on my waist, mine on his shoulder, he leaned in. Don't worry, love. We'll make it work. You, me, and yes, even my parents. I smiled, a mix of hope and apprehension. Promise? Promise, he affirmed, sealing it with a kiss. But promises, I'd learn, are fragile things. The reality hit home when James and I moved into my grandmother's house. It was a quaint place, its walls holding memories of a lifetime. The ramps and low steps, once installed for my grandmother's convenience, now stood as silent testaments to her struggles and strength. Your grandma had it all figured out, huh? James remarked one evening, his gaze trailing over the seamless design. Yeah, she did. She wanted to be independent, no matter what, I said, a hint of pride in my voice. It wasn't long before Mrs. Carter came to visit. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, took in every detail of the house. The way she moved, slowly, deliberately, her cane tapping against the floor, it was like she was marking her territory. This is a nice place, Anna. Very accommodating, she commented, her voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. I forced a smile. Thanks, Mrs. Carter. We like it. But her next words sent a chill down my spine. It's difficult, you know, living in a place that doesn't understand your needs. I think I'd be better off here. The statement hung in the air, a silent ultimatum. James, ever the peacemaker, tried to navigate the treacherous waters. Mom, we can discuss this later. Let's not jump into decisions. But the decision, it seemed, was already made. In her mind, Mrs. Carter had found her new abode. And as I looked into James's eyes, searching for the reassurance I so desperately needed, I realized that our swift marriage was about to face its first real test. The day the Carters moved in, the house changed. It wasn't just the extra shoes by the door or the additional toothbrushes in the bathroom. It was like the air itself shifted, dense with the weight of their presence. I was in the kitchen, trying to make sense of the chaos that had become my pantry, when Mrs. Carter hobbled in. Her cane clicked against the floor, a sound that was quickly becoming the soundtrack of my life. Anna, dear, I was thinking. She started, her voice cutting through the silence. This shelf is too high. I can't reach anything. You should rearrange it. I bit my lip, holding back a sigh. Sure, Mrs. Carter. I'll take care of it. And another thing, she continued, oblivious to my growing frustration. Mark and I should take the bedroom downstairs. It's just too much for me to climb up and down. But that's our bedroom? I protested weakly, the reality of the situation sinking in. She gave me a look, one that said my comfort was secondary. Well, it's just practical, dear. You're young, you can manage. Before I could respond, Mr. Carter entered, his presence like a shadow, always there, but never quite tangible. Is everything all right here? He asked, his voice neutral. Just discussing some adjustments, Mrs. Carter replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. As they left, I felt a surge of resentment. My home, my sanctuary, was being dismantled, piece by piece, and I was expected to smile and nod. The days that followed were a blur of demands and critiques. Mrs. Carter had an opinion on everything: how the furniture should be arranged, what meals should be cooked, how the house should be cleaned. And every evening, James would come home to a battlefield, his attempts to mediate often ending in heated arguments. Anna, we need to be understanding. They're adjusting, he'd say, trying to calm the storm. Adjusting? James, they're not adjusting, they're invading. This is our home, not a hotel for your parents, I'd retort, my patience wearing thin. But the breaking point came one evening, over dinner. Mrs. Carter had made some offhand comment about the meal, how it wasn't to her liking. Something inside me snapped. Mrs. Carter, I understand you're used to things a certain way, but this is my home too. I'm doing my best here, I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. She looked at me, her eyes cold and unyielding. Your best isn't good enough, dear. Maybe if you spent less time at that job of yours and more time here, things would be different. I looked at James, desperate for support, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on his plate. In that moment, I realized the gravity of the situation. I was an outsider in my own home, my life hijacked by the unwelcome presence of the Carters. The tension in the house was like a thick fog, impossible to ignore. Every morning, I woke up to the same routine: prepare breakfast for 4, rush to work, then come back to a list of complaints and demands. It was like living with a ticking bomb, never knowing when the next explosion would be. One evening, I was in the kitchen, trying to juggle preparing dinner and responding to a flurry of work emails when Mrs. Carter came in, her cane tapping a steady, irritating beat on the floor. Anna, this kitchen is a mess. And what's for dinner? I hope it's not that bland chicken dish you made last week, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to snap back. I'm doing the best I can, Mrs. Carter. And it's pasta tonight. She sniffed, making it clear what she thought of my best. You know, if you weren't so tied up with that job of yours, maybe you'd manage the house better. That was it. The final straw. I turned to face her, my hands trembling with frustration. Mrs. Carter, I'm working this job to support us. And I'm also trying to manage the house. I'm only one person. I can't do everything. Her eyes narrowed. Well, maybe you should consider working from home then. That way, you can keep an eye on the house and still do your job. I was flabbergasted. Work from home? Just so I could clean up after them and cook on demand? The thought was suffocating. James and I have been talking, and we think it's the best solution, she continued, as if reading from a script. I felt a surge of anger. You've been talking? And what about me? Don't I get a say in this? Just then, James walked in, and I turned to him, hoping for some support. James, please tell me you don't agree with this. He looked uncomfortable, caught between his mother and his wife. Anna, it's just... Mom has a point. It would make things easier. Easier? For whom? Certainly not for me. I felt like I was drowning, and the people who were supposed to throw me a lifeline were instead pushing me further under. James, this is not about making things easier. It's about respect and boundaries. Your parents moved into my house, and now they're trying to dictate how I live and work. This is not okay, I said, my voice rising with every word. Mrs. Carter interjected, her tone patronizing. Anna, dear, we're family now. We should be helping each other, not arguing over trivial things. Trivial things? My job, my independence, my sanity, were these trivial things? I looked at James, searching his eyes for the man I married, the man who promised to stand by me. But all I saw was indecision, a man torn between his wife and his mother. Under the relentless pressure from Mrs. Carter and the passive compliance of James, I found myself boxed into a corner with no escape. The air in the house was thick with my silent acquiescence as I reluctantly agreed to work from home. Each day melted into the next, a monotonous blend of keystrokes, cooking, and cleaning, all under the watchful, often disapproving, gaze of Mrs. Carter. James, for his part, seemed blind to the imbalance, content to let the scales tip ever in favor of his parents. Then came that fateful evening, the one where the weight of my silence became too heavy to bear. We were gathered around the dinner table, the air heavy with the scent of the meal I had spent hours preparing. Mrs. Carter was mid-complaint about the seasoning of the chicken when I finally found my voice. I'm tired, I said, the words falling from my lips like heavy stones. I'm tired of trying to balance work and taking care of everyone's needs. Maybe it's time we considered living separately. The words hung in the air, a fragile bubble of hope destined to burst. Mrs. Carter paused, her fork midair, her eyes locking with mine. Then, to my utter disbelief, she nodded. I agree, she said, her voice smooth as silk, her tone matter of fact. This arrangement isn't ideal. But this house, it's so well equipped for our needs. So, Anna, it would make sense for you to find another place. The room spun, her words a gut punch that knocked the air from my lungs. I turned to James, desperate for him to intervene, to stand up for us, for our home. But the man I looked to for support merely echoed his mother's sentiment. Mom's right, Anna. This house suits their needs. You can leave here if you like, he said, his words slicing through the last tether of my restraint. His words, so casually delivered, were the culmination of 1,000 tiny betrayals. The man I loved, the man I had built a life with, was offering up my sanctuary, my grandmother's legacy, on a silver platter to appease his parents. Without a word, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The legs of the chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and final. I could feel their eyes on me, wide with surprise, as I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I had looked up just moments ago, my fingers steady, my resolve unwavering. The room was silent except for the muffled voice on the other end of the phone. "Yes, I need to schedule a move," I said, my voice clear and loud enough for everyone to hear. A look of triumph flickered across Mrs. Carter's face, a smug smile curling her lips as she mistook my actions. She thought I was conceding, retreating from my own home. But the reality of my words hadn't hit her yet. I turned to face her, my eyes locking with hers. "Mrs. Carter, you seem to be misunderstanding the situation. The movers aren't for me. They're for you, your husband, and James. You have until the end of the day to pack your things and leave my house." The silence that followed was profound, the words hanging in the air like a verdict. Mrs. Carter's face drained of color, her triumphant smile faltering, transforming into a mask of disbelief and shock. But this is our home now. You can't just throw us out," she stammered, her voice trembling with a mix of outrage and fear. "This was never your home. You imposed yourselves, and your son allowed it. But I'm reclaiming what's rightfully mine," I replied, my voice unwavering. James was on his feet now, his face a mixture of confusion and desperation. "Anna, please, let's talk about this. You don't need to do this. We're a family." The word family hit me like a slap in the face. This was not how family treated each other. This was not how love manifested. "James, a family respects each other. A family supports each other. What happened here was manipulation and disrespect. I'll have the divorce papers sent to you tomorrow," I said, the finality of my words sealing the fate of our marriage. Mrs. Carter started to cry, her sobs a cacophony of disbelief and loss. James tried to plead, his words a jumbled mess of apologies and promises. But it was too late. The decision had been made, the line drawn. The day after the movers had cleared out the last of the Carters' belongings, I stood in the middle of my living room. The sun streamed through the windows, its light touching every corner, every surface, as if to cleanse the space of the heavy shadows of the past months. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the constant noise and tension that had become my daily reality. I wandered from room to room, each step feeling lighter than the last. The house was mine again, my sanctuary, my refuge. I could breathe, truly breathe, without the weight of their expectations suffocating me. It was in this moment of solitude that the doorbell rang, a gentle chime that seemed too loud in the quiet of the house. I opened the door to find my friend Sarah standing there, a warm smile on her face and a casserole dish in her hands. "Heard you might need some company and comfort food," she said, stepping inside. We made our way to the kitchen, the aroma of the casserole filling the space, a scent of normalcy, of home. As we sat down at the table, Sarah reached for my hand, her touch grounding. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. I took a deep breath, the future a blank canvas before me. "Now, I start over. I rebuild, on my terms. It's daunting, sure, but also liberating." Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting understanding and support. "You know, sometimes the best beginnings come from the hardest endings. You've got this, Anna. You're stronger than you think." Her words resonated, a gentle reminder of the resilience that had carried me through the storm. "I guess it's time to find out what I'm really made of," I said, a tentative smile on my lips. The conversation flowed, the comfort of old friendship wrapping around me like a warm blanket. We talked about everything and nothing, the laughter and chatter a balm to my weary soul. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I realized that this was more than just a new beginning. It was a chance to rediscover myself, to redefine my boundaries, to live my life unapologetically. My name is Camila. I was a fresh college graduate, my life brimming with possibilities and dreams, when a single phone call snuffed out my joy like a gust of wind extinguishing a candle. It was a call that brought the news of my parents' tragic death in a car accident. The two people who had been my pillars of strength, my guiding lights, were suddenly gone. The shock of it was like a punch to the gut. I was a grown woman, yes, but I was just starting to navigate the adult world. My parents had been my safety net, my guides. Their sudden absence left me feeling like a ship adrift in a stormy sea. My father, with his hearty laughter and endless wisdom, was my hero. He was a man of strength and kindness, always ready with a word of advice or a comforting hug. I remember our long walks in the park, our deep conversations about everything from philosophy to the latest football game. He was my rock, my safe harbor in the stormy sea of life. My mother, with her gentle nature and unwavering support, was my best friend. She was the one who held my hand during scary movies, who stayed up late helping me with school projects, who was always there with a comforting word and a warm hug. Her love was a constant, soothing presence in my life. Their absence left a gaping hole in my life, a void that seemed impossible to fill. The house felt too quiet, too empty without their laughter and love filling it. Every corner was a reminder of them, every object a memory. In the midst of my grief, a man named Richard appeared. He was a worker at a trading company who happened to be at the scene of the accident. He had provided a witness statement, and he felt compelled to reach out to me, to offer his support. "Camila," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "I can't express how sorry I am for your loss. I saw what happened. It's not fair, and it's not right. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." His words, though simple, were a lifeline in the storm of my grief. Richard became a steady presence in my life, helping me navigate the legalities of the accident, the insurance claims, the mountain of paperwork that seemed to multiply every day. His support was invaluable, his kindness a balm for my aching heart. As the weeks turned into months, Richard and I grew closer. Our conversations grew longer, our silences more comfortable. One day, he took a deep breath, looked me in the eye, and said, "Camila, I've come to care about you a lot. More than I've cared about anyone else. Would you consider marrying me?" I was taken aback, but I looked into his eyes and saw the sincerity there. I thought about the comfort he had provided, the strength he had shown. And I said yes. I said yes to a new beginning, yes to a new chapter in my life. The wedding was a blur of joy and laughter, a day filled with hope and promise. After the celebrations, Richard and I moved into his house that was as grand as it was cold. The house was a testament to Richard's success, a symbol of the wealth he had amassed in his trading business. I was awestruck by its grandeur, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease that crept over me each time I stepped into its marble halls. Soon after the move, I discovered I was pregnant. The news filled me with a sense of joy and anticipation. I dreamed of our child, of the life we would provide for him. Richard seemed pleased as well, but there was a hardness in his eyes that I couldn't quite understand. Our son, Max, was born on a clear winter morning. He was a beautiful baby, with Richard's dark hair and my bright blue eyes. Holding him in my arms, I felt a love so profound, so overwhelming, it took my breath away. Richard, too, seemed smitten with our son. But as the weeks turned into months, I noticed a change in him. One day, Richard came home late from work, his face set in a grim line. "Camila," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth, "we need to talk about our expenses." I was taken aback. "What about them?" I asked, feeling a knot of worry form in my stomach. He threw a stack of bills on the table, his expression stern. "They've gone up, Camila," he said, his voice cold. "Ever since Max was born, we're spending much more than we used to." I felt my heart sink. "But Richard," I said, "we have a baby now. Babies need things." He shot me a hard look. "That's not the point, Camila," he said. "You're spending too much. On things we don't need." I was stunned. I'm spending on our son, Richard, I said, my voice rising in defense. On his needs. His face hardened. I'm the one who's earning, Camila, he said, his voice harsh. I'm the one who's supporting this family. You should be more grateful. His words hit me like a punch in the gut. I felt a mixture of anger and hurt well up inside me. I had thought Richard was my partner, my ally. But his words made it clear that he saw me as a liability, an additional expense that he had to bear. The days following our heated exchange were filled with tension. Richard became more stringent about our budget, scrutinizing every receipt, every purchase. He was relentless in his accusations of my alleged overspending, despite my best efforts to economize. Camila, he'd say, his voice dripping with condescension, you need to understand the value of money. Richard, we need food, I'd say. And Max needs diapers. We can't just stop buying them. He'd look at me, his eyes hard and cold. Then figure it out, Camila. Make do with less. I'd bite my tongue, holding back the retort that was on the tip of it. It wasn't that I didn't understand the value of money, it was that Richard seemed to value it more than he did his own family. Food shopping became a game of strategy. I'd scour the aisles for the cheapest products, calculate the cost per meal, per person. I'd choose the store brands over the name brands, the bruised apples over the pristine ones. I'd walk miles to the store and back, foregoing the cost of public transport to save a few dollars. Richard's decree extended to clothing as well. No new clothes, he'd said, his voice firm, unyielding. Make do with what you have. I looked at my worn-out wardrobe, the frayed edges of my dresses, the faded colors of my shirts. I felt a pang of sadness. I wasn't asking for designer clothes or expensive jewelry. Just something new, something that hadn't been worn to threads. One day, I saw a beautiful little jumper for Max in a store window. It was on sale, but even then, it was more than I could afford. I walked away, my heart heavy. When I got home, Richard was there. You were at the store, weren't you? Buying more stuff we don't need. I didn't buy anything, Richard, I said, my voice steady. I can't. You've made sure of that. He scoffed. Don't play the victim, Camila. You're the one who can't control her spending. I looked at him, my heart pounding. I'm trying to provide for our son, Richard. Can't you see that? He got up, his face red. I'm the one providing for this family, Camila. You're just spending my money. I felt a surge of anger. Your money? Richard, we're a family. It's our money. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Oh, Camila. You're so naive. I stood my ground, my hands clenched. No, Richard. I'm not naive. I'm just trying to do what's best for our son. He glared at me. And I'm trying to save us from bankruptcy. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? With that, he stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, my heart aching. All the while, I noticed Richard's lifestyle remained unchanged. He still wore his designer suits, still splurged on expensive gadgets. He'd come home with a new phone, a new laptop, a new watch, while I was left to mend old clothes and ration our meals. Richard, I'd say, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice, how come you get to buy new things, but I can't? He'd look at me, a smug smile on his face. Because I earn the money, Camila. I get to decide how it's spent. His words stung, a slap in the face. I was his wife, the mother of his child, but he treated me like a burden, like an unwanted expense. His greed was clear, his arrogance palpable. He valued his gadgets more than he valued us. It was a Tuesday when Max came down with a fever. His little body was hot to the touch, his eyes were red from crying. I knew I had to get him medicine, and quick. I rummaged through the cupboards, my heart sinking when I saw them bare. We were out of money, out of options. I did the only thing I could. I took the last of our cash, the money I'd been saving for Richard's favorite steak, and bought medicine for Max. I knew Richard would be mad, knew he'd be furious. But Max was more important. He was my son, my baby. I couldn't let him suffer. When Richard came home that night, he was in a foul mood. He'd had a long day at work, he said, and all he wanted was a good meal. When he saw the empty table, his face turned red. "Camila," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "where's my dinner?" I swallowed hard. "Max was sick," I said. "I used the money to buy him medicine." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You what?" "I bought medicine for Max," I repeated, my voice steady despite the fear in my heart. Richard slammed his fist on the table. "You spent my money on medicine for that brat?" I flinched at his words. "Max is our son, Richard. He was sick." Richard scoffed. "He's always sick. Always needing something. Just like you." I felt a surge of anger. "We're your family, Richard. We're not freeloaders." Richard stood up, his face contorted with rage. "You're nothing but a burden, Camila. You and that kid. All you do is take, take, take." I stood my ground. "We're your responsibility, Richard. You can't just abandon us." Richard laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. "Watch me." And with that, he grabbed my arm, yanked me to the door. "Get out," he said, his voice cold. "Take your brat and get out." I looked at him, my heart pounding. "Richard, please. He's sick. We have nowhere to go." Richard's gaze was icy. "Not my problem." He shoved us out the door, slamming it shut behind us. 5 minutes later, he threw a bag of our clothes at my feet. I stood there, holding Max in my arms, the cold seeping into my bones. I looked at the house, our house, now a fortress we were barred from. That was the final straw. I knew then that I couldn't stay with Richard, couldn't subject Max to his cruelty. We deserved better, deserved a life free of his anger, his greed. So, I walked away, Max clutched in my arms, our future uncertain. But I knew one thing for sure. I would fight for us, fight for a better life. Richard had pushed us away, but he couldn't break us. We were stronger than he thought, stronger than he'd ever know. The city was vast and overwhelming, a concrete jungle where I knew no one. My son, Max, was just a toddler, too young to understand the dire situation we were in. With no money, no friends, and no home, I felt like a ship adrift in a stormy sea. That's when I remembered Grandma. My father's mother, a woman I had seen only once in my life, came to mind. Dad had a strained relationship with her and they had lost contact many years ago. I barely remembered her face, but I remembered the house she lived in, a large, old structure nestled in a quiet town far from the city's bustle. I had no choice but to take a leap of faith. With the last of my money, found in the pocket of my old jacket, I bought 2 intercity bus tickets. Max and I boarded the bus, our future uncertain but our resolve firm. The journey was long, and Max, feeling unwell, whimpered in my arms. I held him close, whispering soothing words, promising a better future. We arrived at Grandma's town as the sun was setting. The large, old house stood just as I remembered, a beacon of hope amidst our turmoil. Gathering my courage, I walked up to the door and knocked. The door creaked open, and there stood Grandma. She was older than I remembered, her face stern and her eyes sharp. She looked at me, a hint of confusion in her eyes. "Yes?" she asked, her voice firm. I swallowed my fear and introduced myself. "Grandma, it's me, Camila. I'm your son's daughter." She squinted at me, studying my face. After a moment, recognition dawned on her. You have your father's eyes, she said, her voice softer. She opened the door wider, inviting us in. We stepped into the house, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold outside. I told Grandma everything about Richard, about Max's illness, about our eviction. I poured out my fears and worries, the burdens I had been carrying alone for so long. Grandma listened, her face hardening as I mentioned Richard. That scoundrel, she spat, her eyes flashing with anger. He'll get what he deserves. In that moment, I felt a surge of relief. Here was someone who believed in me, someone who was on my side. Grandma offered us a place to stay, a place to call home. We were no longer alone, we had Grandma. That night, as Max slept soundly in a warm bed and I sat by the fire with Grandma, I felt a glimmer of hope. The journey to Grandma's was fraught with uncertainty and fear, but it led us to a safe haven. It was our first step towards a new life, a life away from Richard's shadow. The attic was a dusty, forgotten place, filled with boxes upon boxes of old stuff. Grandma hadn't been up there in years, and it showed. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and mothballs, and the floor creaked under my weight. Be careful, Camila, Grandma called from the bottom of the stairs. It's been ages since anyone's been up there. I nodded, my eyes scanning the room. As a person trained as a restorer, I could see the potential in the discarded items. There were old furniture pieces, paintings, knickknacks, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a glimpse into the past. With Grandma's permission, I started working on the items. I cleaned, repaired, and restored them, bringing them back to life. Each piece had a story to tell, a history to uncover. It was a labor of love, a way to keep my mind off the troubles of the past. Days turned into weeks, and before I knew it, the attic was transformed. The old, discarded items were now beautiful antiques, their value increased tenfold. I took some of them to a local antique store, hoping to make a small profit. The owner, a man named Mr. Peterson, was surprised by the quality of the items. These are fantastic, Camila, he said, his eyes wide. Where did you find them? In my grandma's attic, I replied, a smile playing on my lips. She had no idea what she was sitting on. Mr. Peterson laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. Well, she's a lucky woman to have a granddaughter like you. I blushed, thanking him for his kind words. He bought all the items, giving me a hefty sum of money. I was stunned. I had hoped for a small profit, but this was beyond my wildest dreams. When I returned home, Grandma was waiting for me. How did it go? She asked, her eyes hopeful. I showed her the money, her eyes widening in surprise. Oh my, Camila, she said, her voice shaky. I can't believe it. I shrugged, trying to hide my excitement. It's all thanks to you, Grandma. These are your treasures, after all. We celebrated that night, a small victory in our battle for a better life. The attic treasures were more than just old items. They were a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always a glimmer of hope. From then on, I continued to restore the items in the attic. Each piece brought us closer to our goal, each sale a step towards our new life. The attic treasures were our lifeline, our saving grace. And we were grateful for them, for the hope they brought us, for the future they promised. Richard, that good-for-nothing, hadn't bothered to check on us. Not even a call to ask about his son. I guess he was too busy with his new life, too busy to care about the family he left behind. But we weren't going to let him off the hook that easily. Grandma had a friend, a lawyer named Stan. He was a tough old bird, sharp as a tack, and he didn't take any nonsense. We'll get that bastard, he promised, his eyes hard. He won't get away with this. With Stan's help, we filed a claim for child support. Richard was furious when he found out. He called me, his voice a venomous hiss. You'll regret this, Camila, he threatened. You don't know what you're getting into. But I wasn't scared. Not anymore. Bring it on, Richard, I shot back. We'll see who regrets it in the end. The day of the court hearing arrived. Richard strutted in, all puffed up like a peacock, his lawyer by his side. He sneered at me, his eyes cold and hard. But I didn't flinch. I was ready for him. Stan presented our case, his voice steady and firm. He talked about Max, about how Richard had abandoned us, about how he hadn't paid a dime for his son's upkeep. The judge listened, his face impassive. Then it was Richard's turn. His lawyer was smooth, his words slick. He painted Richard as the victim, as a man wronged by his vindictive ex-wife. But we had a trump card. I played a recording of Richard's tirade the night he kicked us out. He didn't know about it, and I decided to surprise him. His threats, his cruel words, all for the court to hear. The room fell silent as his voice filled the air, his true nature exposed for all to see. Richard's face turned pale, his confident facade crumbling. The judge frowned, his eyes hard. "This court will not tolerate such behavior," he said, his voice stern. "Mr. Jackson, you will pay child support as required by law. You also have to pay for the emotional abuse of your ex-wife and son." Richard was stunned. He looked at me, his eyes full of disbelief. But I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The look on his face was victory enough. After the court hearing, Richard tried to worm his way back into our lives. He called me, his voice all sweet and smooth, like honey dripping from a spoon. "Camila," he said, "let's start over. For Max's sake." I laughed, a bitter, cynical laugh. "Start over? With you?" I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. "No, Richard. We're done." I could hear the surprise in his voice. "But Camila," he stammered, "you need me. You can't survive without my money." That's where he was wrong. I had a job now, a good job. I was a restorer, working for a local antique store and a museum. I was making good money, enough to support Max and me. And with Grandma's help, we were doing just fine. "I don't need you, Richard," I said, my voice steady. "I've got a job. A good job. And Max and I are doing just fine." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Richard laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh. "You? Working? I don't believe it." "Well, you better start believing it," I shot back. "Because it's true. And guess what, Richard? I'm not just surviving. I'm thriving." There was more silence. Then Richard hung up, his parting words a venomous hiss. "You'll regret this, Camila. You'll see." But I wasn't scared. Not anymore. I had found my strength, my independence. And there was no going back. The next few months were a whirlwind. I was busy with work, with Max, with life. But I was happy. Truly, genuinely happy. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from Richard, free from fear, free from uncertainty. Grandma was proud of me. "You did good, kid," she said one day, her eyes twinkling. "You stood up for yourself. You took control of your life." I smiled, feeling a sense of pride. "Thanks, Grandma," I said. "I couldn't have done it without you." And that was the truth. Grandma had been my rock, my support. She had stood by me, had helped me find my strength. And for that, I was grateful. The sweet taste of victory was more than just a court win. It was a personal victory, a testament to my strength, my resilience. It was a reminder that I was more than just Richard's ex-wife. I was a survivor, a fighter, a mother, a restorer. And as I looked at Max, his eyes bright with laughter, his face full of joy, I knew I had made the right choice. I had chosen to fight, to stand up for myself, for my son. And I had won. Hello there, my name's Sarah. I'm 27 and I've been working as a nurse for a while. My life has been a whirlwind of hospital shifts, patient checkups, and endless cups of coffee. The hospital corridors have been my world, and my social life? Well, that's been on life support for a while now. So, what's a girl to do when she's got no time to meet people the old-fashioned way? She goes online. I signed up for this dating site, nothing fancy, just one of those places where you hope to find someone who's not a complete weirdo. That's where I bumped into Ryan, virtually of course. His profile was plain, no show-off stuff. Just a guy with a genuine smile and a twinkle in his eyes. We started trading messages, and something clicked. We decided to meet up, see if this online chemistry had any basis in the real world. Our first date was at this cozy little cafe downtown. I walked in, and there he was, waiting for me. "Hey Sarah, you made it," he greeted, his face lighting up like a kid on Christmas morning. I was a bundle of nerves, but his easygoing nature calmed me down. We started chatting, just casual stuff at first. He was a software engineer, loved messing around with codes and all that. He was passionate about his work, but when he spoke about his mother, Margaret, his demeanor changed. "I'm all she's got, you know," he said, his voice dropping a bit. "My old man skipped out on us when I was just a kid. She's been alone since then. I try to help out, send her $1,000 every month. Ain't much, but it keeps her going." I admired his dedication, his sense of responsibility. I shared my own stories, about the grueling hours at the hospital, the emotional roller coaster that my job often was. He listened, really listened, not just nodding along. His eyes were full of understanding, and I felt a connection. As the weeks rolled by, I found myself falling for this guy. He was different, caring and attentive. He'd show up at the hospital when I was pulling late-night shifts, always with a hot meal in tow. He was a breath of fresh air in my otherwise monotonous life. One evening, while we were having dinner at his place, he looked at me, his eyes serious. "Sarah," he said, holding my hand across the table. "I've been doing some thinking. I really like you, more than just a girlfriend. I want us to be a team, you and me. What do you say, will you marry me?" His question caught me off guard. Sure, we hadn't been dating for too long, but there was no denying the love I felt for him. So, I said yes. We were over the moon, excited about our future together. But, boy, was I in for a ride. Little did I know that this decision would lead me down a path full of twists and turns. Life took a sudden turn after that dinner. I was now engaged to Ryan, a man I'd met online, who was as kind and caring as he was committed to his mom. The word fiancé had a new, exciting ring to it. We decided it was time to meet his mom, a woman who lived a couple of hours away in a small town. She was the epicenter of Ryan's world, the person whose opinion mattered the most to him. So, the plan was set: a weekend trip for the two of us to meet the woman who had raised my soon-to-be husband. The drive was filled with a strange tension. Ryan was visibly nervous, his fingers drumming on the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror more often than necessary. He was a man on edge, and it wasn't hard to guess why. "Ryan," I said, trying to soothe his nerves. "Relax. I'm sure your mom is a wonderful person." He shot me a half-smile, his eyes still on the road. "Yeah, she's something all right." His mom's house was a picture of quaint charm, a small structure that looked like it had jumped straight out of a home and garden magazine. As we pulled up, I saw her waiting for us on the porch, a frail figure with a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Ryan, my boy," Margaret exclaimed as soon as we got out of the car, enveloping him in a tight hug. After a moment, she turned to me, her gaze icy. "You must be Sarah." I extended a hand, forcing a smile. Yes, ma'am. It's a pleasure to meet you. The afternoon was a whirlwind of conversation, a deep dive into Ryan's life and his mom's sacrifices. She painted a vivid picture of their shared journey, of the struggles they'd overcome together. It was touching, but also a bit overwhelming. "So, Sarah," she said at one point, her eyes boring into me. "Ryan tells me you're a nurse." I nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I work at the city hospital." "And your family?" she asked, her gaze never wavering. "Who do you have?" I swallowed, a lump forming in my throat. I don't remember my parents. My grandmother raised me." She nodded, her eyes softening a bit. "Well, I suppose we all have our crosses to bear." The conversation took a strange turn then. She talked about blessing our marriage, but on one condition. We had to keep sending her the monthly $1,000. I was taken aback. I knew Ryan helped her out, but this felt different. It felt like a transaction. "Ma," Ryan said, his voice firm. "We're planning to get married, not sign a contract." Margaret shot him a stern look. "This is not a negotiation, Ryan. It's what I need." Ryan looked at me, his eyes pleading. It was a tough situation, one that I didn't want to escalate. So, I agreed. I agreed to this bizarre condition, for Ryan's sake. The wedding planning kicked off with a bang. Ryan and I were excited, brimming with ideas and dreams for our big day. We had decided on a simple ceremony, something that reflected our love and commitment without breaking the bank. After all, we had a significant monthly commitment to Ryan's mom, which kept our budget modest. But love, we believed, didn't need an extravagant show. Our venue was the local church, a charming little structure with an air of warmth and familiarity. Father John, the pastor and a dear friend of Ryan's, was more than willing to officiate our wedding. His twinkling eyes and hearty congratulations made us feel even more special. The guest list was a short one, a handful of work friends, Ryan's childhood buddies, and, of course, his mom. Margaret had a strong presence in our lives, and her involvement in the wedding planning was no different. She was there at every turn, her opinions shaping our choices, from the color scheme to the menu. "I think we should serve roast beef," she declared during one of our planning sessions. "Ryan loves it." Ryan, ever the dutiful son, nodded in agreement. "But Mom," he added, "Sarah's a vegetarian. We need to consider her too." His mom simply raised an eyebrow. "Well, it's your wedding too, isn't it?" Ryan didn't argue. He simply agreed and let his mom have her way. I didn't mind much. I was too caught up in the joy of marrying the man I loved. But there was another person who was deeply involved in our wedding planning, my grandmother. She was my rock, my guiding light. She had raised me single-handedly, and her wisdom and strength had always been my inspiration. Grandma was thrilled about the wedding. She helped me pick out a simple but elegant white dress. She baked cookies for the reception, her hands working magic in the kitchen. And she was there, always there, with a smile and a word of encouragement. The day of the wedding was a whirlwind of emotions. I was nervous, excited, and a little overwhelmed. Ryan looked dashing in his blue suit, his eyes sparkling with joy. His mom, in a striking red dress, was the life of the party, chatting and laughing with everyone. The ceremony was a beautiful, heartwarming affair. Father John spoke eloquently about love and commitment, his words resonating with everyone present. As Ryan and I exchanged our vows, I could see tears in Grandma's eyes. It was a moment I would cherish forever. The reception, held in the church hall, was a fun-filled event. The roast beef was a hit, and even though I couldn't partake, I was happy to see everyone enjoying it. Ryan's mom made sure to remind everyone that it was her idea. I didn't mind. I was too caught up in the joy of the day. As the day came to a close, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We were married. We were starting a new chapter in our lives. I knew there would be challenges, but I was ready to face them. I had Ryan, and I had Grandma. I was ready for whatever life had in store for us. In the weeks following our wedding, Ryan and I were on cloud nine. We had moved into a small rented apartment and were slowly settling into our new life together. Our days were filled with love and laughter, and our nights with dreams of a future we were eager to build together. One of our major goals was to save for a down payment on a house. We had a plan, a budget, and a piggy bank that we lovingly called our future home. Every penny we saved was a step closer to our dream. But our financial plan had a significant dent: the $1,000 we sent to Ryan's mom every month. Ryan's mom was a constant presence in our lives, and not always a welcome one. She had a knack for showing up unannounced, often with a list of complaints and demands. Her favorite topic was her financial struggles and how we needed to help her more. One evening, she arrived at our apartment with a stack of papers. "Ryan, dear," she began, her voice dripping with sweetness, "we need to discuss something." Ryan, ever the obedient son, sat down with her, a look of concern on his face. "What is it, Mom?" he asked. She slid a paper across the table to him. "I need you to sign this," she said. It was a contract, a formal agreement that we, all the time we're married, would continue to send her $1,000 every month. But that wasn't all. She also wanted us to cover her utility bills, and part of other costs. Ryan was taken aback. "Mom, we're already helping you out every month. We can't afford all this," he protested. She simply shrugged. "You'll find a way," she said, her voice cold and unfeeling. I was speechless. The audacity of her demand was shocking. But before I could react, Ryan had already signed the contract. He looked at me apologetically. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said. "I didn't see this coming." I was seething with anger, not at Ryan, but at his mother. She was exploiting us, and it wasn't fair. "This isn't right," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You can't just demand money from us like this." She simply smirked. "I just did." The drive home was a silent one. I was too angry, and Ryan was too guilty. Our dream of owning a home seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a growing pile of bills and obligations. Life was a non-stop roller coaster ride with Ryan and his mother. No matter what we did, it felt like we were always under her microscope, and every move we made was met with her disapproval. It was suffocating, and it was starting to eat away at our happiness. The situation reached boiling point one evening when she came over for her usual uninvited visit. Ryan and I had been discussing the possibility of starting a family. We were excited about the idea of bringing a new life into this world. But when I shared our plans with his mother, her reaction was far from supportive. "A baby? Are you two nuts?" Margaret bellowed, her face turning an alarming shade of red. "You can barely keep your heads above water, and now you want to add a baby to this circus?" I was taken aback by her outburst. "We've thought about this, and we believe we're ready," I countered, trying to keep my voice calm. She snorted. "Ready? You think you're ready? You can't even handle your own lives, and now you want to toss a baby into the mix?" I turned to Ryan, hoping he would step in, but he just sat there, his face ashen. His mother's words had struck a nerve, and he seemed lost for words. "Instead of thinking about a baby, you should be thinking about me," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "I'm not getting any younger. I need you to take care of me, not some snot-nosed brat." I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me. "We're not your babysitters," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "We have our own lives to live. And we won't let you dictate them." Margaret turned to Ryan, tears welling up in her eyes. "Is this how you treat your mother? Is this how you repay me for all I've done for you?" Ryan looked at me, then at his mother. I could see the turmoil in his eyes. He was caught between his loyalty to his mother and his love for me. Finally, he spoke up. "Mom's right, Sarah," he said, his voice wavering. "We're not ready for a baby. We have too many responsibilities already." His words were like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I turned to him, my eyes filled with disbelief. "So, you're taking her side now?" He didn't answer, just looked down at his hands. That was all the answer I needed. I got up and stormed out of the room, leaving Ryan and his mother alone. That night, Ryan and I had the biggest argument we've ever had. We yelled, we cried, we said things we didn't mean. But in the end, nothing was resolved. He still sided with his mother, and I was left feeling betrayed and alone. The following weeks were a nightmare. Ryan's mother was more intrusive than ever, and Ryan was more distant. As a result, I just stopped communicating with Margaret, even if it was rude, but not seeing her was already a great achievement. She called me an impudent girl and stopped calling me too. I'd been noticing a change in Ryan for a while. He was always on his phone, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he sent text after text. He was coming home late from work, his excuse always the same: "Just got caught up at the office, babe." I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. I tried to convince myself that it was just work stress, that he was just busy. But deep down, I knew something was off. My suspicions were confirmed when my best friend, Lisa, called me one evening. "Sarah, I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice shaking. "I found Ryan's profile on that dating site we used to use." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. "What? That's impossible," I stammered, my mind racing. "He wouldn't." "I'm sorry, Sarah," Lisa said, her voice filled with sympathy. "I thought you should know." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right there. When Ryan came home that night, I confronted him. "Who is she, Ryan?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. "Who are you texting all the time? Who are you meeting on that dating site?" Ryan looked at me, his face pale. "I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room. "Don't lie to me, Ryan," I yelled, my patience wearing thin. "I know about the dating site. I know you're seeing someone else." Ryan didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me. Then, he let out a sigh. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want you to find out this way." I felt a surge of anger. "So, you admit it? You've been cheating on me?" Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with guilt. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't mean for this to happen. It just did." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man I loved, the man I had planned to start a family with, was cheating on me. And to make matters worse, he wasn't even sorry about it. "I want a divorce, Ryan," I said, my voice steady. "I can't be with someone I can't trust." Ryan didn't argue, didn't try to convince me to stay. He just nodded, his face a mask of guilt and regret. 6 months had passed since my divorce from Ryan, and life was starting to settle into a new rhythm. I was learning to live alone, to be independent. Then, my grandmother passed away. She'd been a rock in my life, a woman of strength and wisdom. Her passing left me with a gaping hole, but also, unexpectedly, a considerable inheritance. She'd left me her old mansion, a beautiful house with vast gardens and rooms filled with antique furniture. And there was also a hefty sum of money, enough to let me live comfortably for the rest of my life. I was shocked, overwhelmed, but also grateful. It was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life. Just as I was starting to adjust to this new reality, there was a knock on the door. Standing on my doorstep was none other than Ryan's mother, a woman who'd always been a thorn in my side. "Well, look at you, living in luxury," she sneered, looking around the mansion with greedy eyes. I heard about your little windfall. You must be over the moon. I crossed my arms, raising an eyebrow at her. What do you want, Margaret? She put on a saccharine smile, her eyes still scanning the house. Well, dear, I thought it's only fair that since you and my son are married, I should get a share of this fortune. I couldn't help but laugh. Margaret, you're out of the loop. Ryan and I divorced 6 months ago. Her eyes widened, and she sputtered. What? No, that can't be right. Ryan would have told me. Call him and ask, I suggested, leaning against the doorframe. He'll confirm it. She pulled out her phone, dialed Ryan's number, and put it on speaker. Ryan, tell me it's not true, she demanded when he answered. Tell me you and Sarah are still married. There was a pause, and then Ryan's voice came through, sounding resigned. No, Mom, we're not. We divorced 6 months ago. Ryan's mom ended the call, her face pale. You've made a fool of me, she said, her voice trembling. And you, Ryan, you're an idiot for letting this gold mine slip through your fingers. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed off, leaving me standing in the doorway, shaking with laughter. It felt good to finally stand up to Margaret, to see her taken down a peg. I'd been through a lot, but I was coming out the other side stronger, more confident. My new life was just beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. I had a beautiful house, financial security, and most importantly, I was free from the shackles of an unhappy marriage. As I closed the door, I couldn't help but smile. Life was looking up. The sun had already started to set when I heard the knock. I opened the door to find my ex-husband, Ryan, standing there. His sudden appearance was as surprising as it was unwelcome. What the hell are you doing here, Ryan? I asked, my voice laced with annoyance. I heard about your inheritance, Sarah, he stammered, his eyes darting around the grand entrance of the mansion. Is it true? I crossed my arms over my chest, raising an eyebrow at him. Yeah, it's true. My grandmother left me her house and a substantial amount of money. What's it to you? Ryan swallowed hard, his gaze never leaving mine. I was thinking, maybe we could give it another shot, Sarah, he said, his voice shaky. I've been a fool. I let my mother dictate our lives. I didn't stand up for you when I should have. I want to make it right. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. Oh, now you want to make it right? I asked, shaking my head in disbelief. Now that I'm rich, you suddenly want to be a better man? You think I can't see right through you, Ryan? Ryan looked taken aback by my words, but he quickly composed himself. It's not like that, Sarah, he said, his voice filled with desperation. I've changed. I can be a better man. I can make it up to you. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see the greed in his eyes, the dollar signs practically flashing in his pupils. He was no different from his arrogant mother. He was just after my money. Listen here, Ryan, I said, my voice cold as ice. You had your chance. You blew it. Now, you want to waltz back into my life because I've come into some money? You're even more pathetic than I thought. Ryan flinched at my words, but he didn't back down. I just want to make it right, Sarah, he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. I just want another chance. I shook my head, a humorless smile on my face. You're not getting another chance, Ryan, I said, my voice steady. You're not getting a dime of my money. Now get off my property before I call the cops. With that, I slammed the door in his face, leaving him standing on the doorstep. I could hear him calling out to me, begging for forgiveness, but I ignored him. I had better things to do than listen to his empty promises and pleas. I walked away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I'd finally stood up to Ryan, to his manipulations and his lies. I'd finally stood up for myself. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking about Ryan less and less. I was moving on, slowly but surely. I was building a new life for myself, a life that was mine and mine alone. I made new friends, people who liked me for who I was, not for my money or my mansion. I started volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding joy in helping those who couldn't help themselves. I was finally living my life on my own terms, and it felt amazing. I'm Mary, 29, an accountant. I've always been the kind of person who thrives on order and predictability. But then, life threw me a curveball named Mike. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party. The moment I walked in, I spotted him across the room, laughing loudly, the center of attention. I was content to stay in the background, but my friend, Jess, had other ideas. "Mary, you've got to meet Mike. He's hilarious," Jess insisted, dragging me over to him. I remember thinking, this is going to be awkward, but to my surprise, it wasn't. Mike was easygoing, his laughter infectious. I found myself laughing more in that one evening than I had in months. "Hey, I'm Mike." "And you are?" he asked with a smile that reached his eyes. "Mary. Nice to meet you," I replied, a bit more enthusiastically than I intended. He cracked a joke about accountants being party animals in disguise, and I couldn't help but laugh. We spent the rest of the evening chatting. He was into graphic design, loved indie music, and had a passion for cooking. I remember leaving the party feeling lighter, happier. Mike had this way of making everything seem fun and exciting. Over the next few weeks, we saw a lot of each other. He'd show up at my apartment with takeout from the newest restaurant in town or tickets to a concert. "Life's too short for routines, Mary. Gotta mix it up," he'd say. I was drawn to his spontaneity, a stark contrast to my structured life. He had this knack for pulling me out of my comfort zone, and I loved it. But I started to notice little things. Like how he'd casually drop $100 on a night out without a second thought, or how he'd switch jobs because he got bored with the old one. I tried talking to him about it once. We were at my place, and I broached the subject as delicately as I could. "Mike, don't you think you should be a bit more careful with money? And maybe stick with a job longer?" He just laughed it off. "Mary, you worry too much. Life's about having fun. Money, jobs, they come and go." I wanted to argue, to explain that that's not how the world works, but I didn't. I let it slide, telling myself that it was just Mike being Mike. When he proposed, it was out of the blue. We were walking in the park, and he just blurted it out. "Marry me, Mary. Let's make this adventure official." It was impulsive, irrational, and completely Mike. And I said yes. We moved in together, into my house. It seemed like the perfect start to our life together. And I thought, maybe, just maybe, opposites could really attract and hold together. The days of laughter and impromptu adventures with Mike gradually gave way to a sobering reality. His carefree attitude, once the source of our connection, started to feel more like a growing divide. It was a Thursday evening when the first major crack appeared. I had stayed late at work to catch up on some demanding accounts. Tired and hungry, I arrived home, hoping for a quiet night. Instead, I walked into a scene that looked like the aftermath of a shopping spree. Bags from various stores were strewn across the living room, and there was Mike, lounging on the sofa with a self-satisfied grin. "Mary, you're home. Look at these deals I found today," he exclaimed, gesturing towards the bags. I dropped my keys on the table, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "Mike, we talked about this last week, about saving money and cutting down on unnecessary expenses." He shrugged, flipping through a magazine. "Yeah, but these were on sale. Besides, we needed some of these things." I picked up a receipt from one of the bags and felt my heart sink. Needed? Mike, these are luxury items, not essentials. We have a budget for a reason. Mike looked up, his expression shifting from casual to defensive. Come on, Mary, don't be such a killjoy. We deserve to treat ourselves once in a while. I sighed, trying to keep my voice calm. It's not about being a killjoy, Mike. It's about being responsible. We have bills, a mortgage, and we agreed to save for a rainy day. He rolled his eyes and tossed the magazine aside. You always make a big deal out of everything. Can't you just relax for once? Then, one morning, I found an envelope addressed to Mike on the dining table. It was from his workplace. Curious, I opened it and felt my world tilt. Mike had resigned from his job without a word to me. When he finally came down for breakfast, I confronted him, the letter in my hand. Mike, what is this? You quit your job? Why didn't you discuss it with me first? He poured himself coffee, unfazed. Yeah, I quit. That job was a dead end, Mary. I need something better, something that excites me. But how are we going to manage our expenses? We need 2 incomes, Mike. You know this, I said, my voice rising with frustration. He shrugged, taking a sip of his coffee. We'll figure it out. We always do. You need to stop worrying so much. How can I not worry? We have financial commitments, Mike. This is not just about you or me, it's about us, our future, I argued, trying to make him see reason. Mike set down his cup with a thud. I can't deal with this right now, Mary. You're suffocating me with all this talk about money and responsibility. I watched in disbelief as he walked away, leaving me standing in the kitchen, letter in hand, feeling more alone than ever. Mike's unemployment, which initially seemed like a short-term hiccup, rapidly grew into a persistent source of stress and contention in our household. Each morning, as I prepared for work, I'd find Mike in the same spot on the couch, engrossed in either the TV or his phone. The sight became a painful reminder of our growing financial strain. Mike, it's been weeks since you quit your job. Have you started looking for something new? I asked one morning, trying to mask the concern in my voice as I adjusted my work badge. He barely glanced up from his phone. Yeah, I'm looking. Nothing's caught my eye yet. I'm waiting for the right opportunity. His nonchalant reply irked me. Right opportunity? We have bills piling up, Mike. We can't wait forever. He finally looked up, his expression a mix of annoyance and indifference. Mary, you need to chill. I know what I'm doing. I'll find something soon. Days turned into weeks, and the situation at home remained unchanged. I began to take on extra hours at work to keep up with our financial obligations, my exhaustion growing with each passing day. One evening, I came home to an unexpected scene. The living room was littered with pizza boxes and empty beer cans. Mike was sprawled on the couch, snoring lightly. The TV blared in the background. Mike, I called out, frustration evident in my tone. He stirred and blinked at me sleepily. What's up? He mumbled, rubbing his eyes. What's up? Look at this mess. And dinner? Were you planning to cook tonight? I asked, my patience wearing thin. He sat up, yawning. Oh, I forgot. Got caught up with the game. Grab something on your way home next time. I felt a surge of anger. I'm working extra hours to make ends meet, Mike. The least you could do is help around the house. He stood up, stretching lazily. I didn't ask you to work extra. You're choosing to stress yourself out. The conversation escalated quickly. Choosing to stress out? Mike, if I don't, how are we going to survive? You're sitting here doing nothing while I'm out there trying to keep us afloat. Mike's expression hardened. I'm not doing nothing. I'm trying to find a job. You think I like being stuck at home? Trying? By sitting on the couch all day? You're not even trying, Mike. This isn't what I signed up for when we got married. I shot back, my voice tinged with both anger and sadness. Mike scoffed. Well, sorry for not living up to your perfect standards, Mary. I didn't realize I married a nag. I was taken aback by his harsh words. A nag? Is it too much to ask for a partner who contributes? I don't understand how you can be so relaxed about our situation. He grabbed his jacket, heading towards the door. I need some air. I can't deal with this right now. The tension in our home had reached a boiling point. Every conversation with Mike about responsibility and our future ended in a heated argument, leaving a cold silence in its wake. I was tired, both physically from the extra hours at work and emotionally from the constant strain at home. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, sorting through bills and trying to make the numbers work, I realized something had to give. Mike, I began, my voice steady but firm, we need to talk. This can't go on any longer. He glanced up from his phone, his expression indifferent. What now, Mary? It's about your job situation. Or rather, the lack of one. It's been months, Mike. We're sinking here, and you don't seem to care, I said, the frustration evident in my tone. Mike let out a heavy sigh. Here we go again. Look, I'm trying, okay? You think I enjoy this? You think I like seeing you stressed all the time? Then do something about it. Find a job, any job. We need 2 incomes, Mike. We agreed on this when we got married. I shot back, my patience wearing thin. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You think it's so easy, huh? Just snap my fingers and a job appears? You don't get it, Mary. The market's tough. I need something that suits me. Something that suits you? I repeated, incredulous. We don't have the luxury of waiting for the perfect job, Mike. We have bills, a mortgage, responsibilities. Mike paced the room, running his hands through his hair. I can't deal with this pressure, Mary. It's constant with you. Nag, nag, nag. I stood up, facing him. This is not about nagging, Mike. This is about our life, our future. If you can't understand that, then maybe this isn't going to work. Mike stopped pacing, his eyes meeting mine. What are you saying? I took a deep breath. I'm saying that if you don't find a job, if you don't start taking our situation seriously, then maybe we need to rethink this marriage. The words hung heavy in the air between us. Mike's face hardened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then, without a word, he grabbed his jacket and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I sat back down, my hands trembling slightly. I hadn't meant for it to come to this, but the endless cycle of arguments and indifference had worn me down. Days passed with no word from Mike. The silence was both a relief and a worry. Then, late one evening, my phone rang, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was the hospital. Mrs. Smith? Your husband, Mike Smith, was brought in after an accident. He's stable, but he sustained some injuries. The news hit me like a punch to the stomach. I rushed to the hospital, my mind racing with worry and 1,000 unanswered questions. The sterile, impersonal atmosphere of the hospital was a sharp contrast to the emotional turmoil I was feeling. Sitting beside Mike's hospital bed, I watched him, his leg in a bulky cast, his face reflecting pain and vulnerability. It was a side of Mike I hadn't seen before, and it stirred a complex mix of emotions within me. As Mike's eyes fluttered open, he squinted at me, confusion giving way to realization. Mary? You're here. His voice was weak, laden with a mix of guilt and relief. I forced a smile, trying to keep the conversation light. Yeah, I'm here. How are you feeling? He winced as he tried to adjust his position. Like I'd been run over. Which, I guess, isn't far from the truth. What did the doctors say? They said you were lucky. The injury could have been worse. It's a severe fracture, and you'll need time to heal, I explained, watching his face for a reaction. Mike exhaled deeply, his eyes meeting mine. Mary, I'm sorry. I've been such a fool, and now this, his voice trailed off. I sighed, feeling a wave of conflicting feelings. Mike, we can sort through all that later. Right now, you need to focus on getting better. But he persisted, a hint of urgency in his tone. No, I need to say this. I've been self-centered, and I've put you through so much. This accident, it's made me see things differently. I listened, unsure of how to respond. I appreciate you saying that, Mike. But it's going to take more than words to fix what's been broken. He nodded solemnly. I know, and I want to make it right. I'll find a job as soon as I'm able. I'll help out more around the house, whatever it takes. The conversation was briefly interrupted by the nurse who came in to check on Mike's vitals. After she left, we resumed our talk. Mike, it's not just about the job or the housework. It's about us, our relationship. We've been drifting apart, and it's going to take effort to bridge that gap, I said, my voice steady but filled with emotion. He reached out, taking my hand. I know I've messed up, Mary. But this accident, lying here, all I could think about was you. How much you mean to me, and how I've taken you for granted. I felt a lump in my throat. His words were touching, yet I was cautious. I want to believe you, Mike. I really do. But we've had so many false starts. I need to see that you're serious about this change. The nurse returned, her cheerful demeanor a stark contrast to the heavy mood. We're going to start some mild physiotherapy soon. It'll be a journey, but you're in good hands. After she left, Mike looked at me, a newfound resolve in his eyes. I know it's going to be a long road, but I want you with me, Mary. If you're willing to give me that chance. Bringing Mike home from the hospital marked the beginning of a new, challenging chapter in our lives. His broken leg meant he was confined to the bed or the couch, and his dependence on me for the simplest of tasks was a stark change from his previous self-reliance. The first few days were a flurry of adjusting to the new routine. I juggled my work commitments with playing nurse to Mike. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find Mike glaring at the TV, a frown etched on his face. Mike, how are you feeling? Do you need anything? I asked, dropping my bag and kicking off my shoes. He turned his head, his expression sour. Where have you been? I've been calling out for help to get to the bathroom, and you were nowhere. I felt a twinge of guilt mixed with frustration. I had to stay late at work, Mike. You know my job is demanding. I can't just leave whenever I want. He scoffed. Well, maybe your job shouldn't be more important than your husband. As the days went on, Mike's demands grew. He wanted specific meals at specific times, his medication handed to him on the dot, and constant attention. If something wasn't to his liking, he made sure to voice his displeasure. One Saturday, I spent hours preparing his favorite dish, hoping it would lift his spirits. As I set the plate down in front of him, he looked at it and then up at me with disdain. This is what you made? It's too salty. Can't you do anything right? I felt my patience snap. Mike, I've been running around all day, trying to take care of you and keep up with everything else. A little appreciation wouldn't hurt. He sneered, pushing the plate away. Appreciation? For this? I'm stuck in this bed because of my leg, and all I ask is for a decent meal. I stood up, my hands trembling with anger. You know what, Mike? I'm not your servant. I'm your wife, and I deserve some respect. Mike's eyes flashed with anger. Respect? You want respect? How about respecting my condition? I'm the one who's suffering here. As I walked away to cool down, I realized that the man I was trying to help was becoming increasingly unrecognizable. The sweet, apologetic person I had seen in the hospital had vanished, replaced by someone who seemed to take pleasure in belittling me at every turn. That fateful day, I returned home from work earlier than usual. The house, usually quiet during these hours, echoed with an unfamiliar sound of laughter coming from Mike's room. My heart pounding, I tiptoed closer, a sense of dread growing with each step. Peering through the slightly open door, I saw Mike, animated and cheerful, chatting on the phone. "Oh yeah, I've settled in quite well here," he said with a laugh. "Mary doesn't have a clue." My breath caught in my throat. Who was he talking to? What was he talking about? A cold shiver ran down my spine as I processed his words. I backed away, my mind racing, then loudly re-entered the house, slamming the door to announce my presence. I composed myself and walked into his room. Mike, hearing the door slam, quickly changed his demeanor and ended the call. "Mary, you're back," he said, feigning weakness. "Hey, how are you feeling?" I asked, masking my turmoil with a concerned smile. "Just the same, you know," he replied, avoiding my gaze. The next day, I contacted a private detective, someone I knew from a previous work case. "I need you to find out everything about my husband's activities," I told him over the phone. "And there's a woman he might be involved with." While the detective did his work, I played the part of the dutiful wife. It was agonizing, acting as if everything was normal when every instinct screamed that my world was falling apart. 2 weeks later, the detective got back to me. The news was worse than I had imagined. Mike had been in an accident with his mistress, who was listed in the police reports. The detective provided me with her name, and a quick search on social media revealed her profile, filled with pictures of her and Mike looking intimately close. But there was more. The detective had uncovered Mike's gambling debts, a staggering amount that threatened to drown us financially. I sat in the living room, the evidence of Mike's betrayal laid out before me, feeling a mix of anger, disbelief, and heartache. How best to unveil his deceit? How to make him realize the gravity of his betrayal? For now, I kept these thoughts to myself, waiting for the right moment to turn the tables. The morning light filtered through the curtains as I steeled myself for the confrontation ahead. Entering Mike's room, where he lay with his broken leg, I braced myself for the performance of a lifetime. "Mike, I need to talk to you about something important," I said, my voice calm but firm. He looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "What now, Mary? Can't you see I'm in pain here?" I maintained my composure. "I've made a decision for your better care. You're being moved to a state medical facility tomorrow. They're equipped to handle your rehabilitation more effectively." Mike's expression turned from annoyance to panic. "What? No, you can't do that. I want to stay here, with you." "I'm sorry, Mike, but this is for the best." "I'll start packing your things," I said, turning towards the door. As I closed it behind me, I heard the frantic rustling of sheets and Mike's hurried voice calling someone on the phone. "She's sending me to some facility. You have to help me." About an hour later, a car pulled up outside. Mike's mistress barged into our house, her face a mask of determination and concern. She marched directly to Mike's room, with me trailing behind. "I'm here to take him with me. He's not going to any facility," she declared, her voice laced with a sense of ownership. I followed her into the room, my heart pounding but my face calm. "I'm glad you're here. This was all a setup to get you to show your hand." Mike and his mistress exchanged a look of confusion and fear. "What are you talking about, Mary?" Mike asked, his voice quivering. I held up the evidence collected by the detective, photos of them together. "This is the proof of your affair. I'll be seeking compensation for this betrayal." The mistress laughed, though her eyes betrayed her nervousness. "I can pay whatever you want. He's coming with me." My smile was thin, but confident. "You should know, he's neck-deep in gambling debts, and without a job, he can't afford his medical bills or insurance. Are you ready to handle all that?" Her face went pale, the implications of what I'd said slowly sinking in. Mike's eyes darted between us, a look of utter helplessness on his face. "But I can't deal with all that," she stammered, her confidence crumbling. "Seems like he's your problem now," I said with a cold finality, turning to leave the room. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. I filed for divorce, ensuring I received a fair settlement for Mike's betrayal and deceit. His mistress, now burdened with his financial and medical responsibilities, quickly found herself overwhelmed. Rumors reached me over time about their strained relationship, riddled with arguments and financial woes. Mike's downfall was a tale of his own making, and his mistress was now ensnared in the web of consequences. As for me, I found solace in my newfound freedom and independence. The betrayal had been painful, a stark lesson in trust and deception. Yet, it also imparted a strength I never knew I had. I moved forward with my life, emboldened by my resilience and determined to find happiness on my own terms, free from the shadows of deceit and betrayal. I'm Irene, navigating life at 30 with a mix of web design and motherhood. Our family nucleus was simple: me, my husband Mike, and our 2-year-old sunshine, Danny. Our world was comfortably wrapped within the walls of our home, which stood as a testament to the life we built together. Mike worked for my dad's company, a job he was proud of, and I carved pixels into designs for my home studio. Our routine was pleasantly mundane until one evening at my parents' house, where family dinners were more than just meals. They were gatherings punctuated by discussions, laughter, and, sometimes, life-changing announcements. "So, I've been thinking," my dad began, his voice commanding the room's attention. He was a self-made man, a pillar of wisdom in business suits. "We're expanding the company. There's a new branch opening in the neighboring city, and I want Mike to take the lead on this." Mike, who had always admired my dad, perked up immediately. His eyes gleamed with a mix of excitement and determination. "Mr. Thompson, that's a fantastic opportunity. I'm all in." I felt a surge of pride and excitement. "That's wonderful news. We should all move there for the project duration. It's just a few months, and it'll be like a little adventure," I said, already envisioning our temporary life in a new city. Unexpectedly, Mike hesitated, casting a glance that didn't quite reach his usual confidence. "Actually, Irene, it might be better if you and Danny stay here. Moving could be a hassle for the little guy." His words hit me unexpectedly, like a cold splash of reality in our warm, cozy life. "But Mike, I thought we were in this together. And it's not like we have to uproot our lives. I can work from anywhere, and it would be a nice change for Danny." My dad nodded in agreement, his voice echoing my thoughts. "Mike, Irene has a point. The family should stick together in such times. And Irene's job gives her that flexibility." Mike seemed to be caught off guard, a nervous chuckle escaping him. "I was just joking. Of course, you both should come along." But that joke didn't sit right with me. It lingered in the air, an uninvited guest at our family dinner. The evening progressed with Dad and Mike diving into the logistics of the new business venture, but my mind was stuck on Mike's initial reaction. Why the hesitation? Why the reluctance? Later that night, after tucking Danny into bed, I found myself sitting across from Mike in our living room. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil in my mind. "Mike, about dinner tonight," I started, my voice a blend of confusion and concern. "You really caught me off guard, suggesting that Danny and I shouldn't join you. Is there something on your mind?" He looked up from his phone, meeting my gaze for the first time since we sat down. "Irene, I didn't mean to upset you. It's just that setting up a new branch will be demanding. I thought it'd be easier for you to stay put, avoid the stress of moving." I leaned forward, searching his face for the familiar comfort. "But we've always faced challenges together. That's what we do. Why would this time be any different?" Mike sighed, putting his phone down. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You're right, we do. And we will." I guess I was just overthinking it. It was a silly thought, nothing more. His words were meant to reassure, but they hung heavy in the room, a reminder that something in our equation had shifted, however slightly. Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs just when you think you've got it all figured out. Our little family was on the brink of a new adventure, or so I thought, until Danny, our 2-year-old bundle of joy, decided to rewrite our plans. It started with a mild fever, nothing too alarming at first, but it quickly escalated. I remember holding Danny in my arms, feeling his little body burning up as I dialed our family doctor. "Dr. Jacobs, Danny's fever isn't coming down." "I'm really worried," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. After a thorough checkup, Dr. Jacobs' expression was serious. "Irene, I'm afraid it's more than just a common cold. Danny needs rest and cannot travel for a while. Moving to a new city is out of the question right now." The news hit me like a ton of bricks. I called Mike that evening, the weight of uncertainty heavy in my voice. "Mike, Danny's sick. The doctor advised against traveling. We can't join you for now." On the other end, there was a pause before Mike responded. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Oh, is it serious? Well, that's okay, Irene. He needs to get better. We can manage." Something about his response didn't sit right with me. There was an undertone of relief, perhaps even contentment, that Danny and I wouldn't be joining him. It gnawed at me, that unsettling feeling of doubt. The weeks that followed were tough. Danny's illness turned out to be a stubborn infection that took its time healing. My days and nights merged into a blur of caregiving, leaving little room for anything else. Mike's calls became infrequent, and when he did call, his words felt rehearsed, lacking the warmth I was used to. "Everything's okay here, Irene. Just busy with work. How's Danny?" I'd update him, hoping for more engagement, but the conversations were brief and perfunctory. "He's getting better, slowly. We miss you, Mike." "Yeah, I miss you guys too," he'd reply, but it sounded hollow, as if he was saying it out of obligation rather than feeling. The distance was growing, not just in miles, but in our connection. It felt like Mike was slipping away, retreating into a world I wasn't part of. One evening, after a particularly short and unsatisfying call with Mike, I sat in the living room long after Danny had fallen asleep. The silence of the house echoed my thoughts. Was this what our life was going to be now? Mike distant and preoccupied, and me, alone, holding down the fort? Days turned into weeks, and the distance between Mike and me felt more than just miles apart. It was as if he was slowly drifting away, becoming a stranger. His calls, once filled with laughter and warmth, were now just formal check-ins. One evening, as I was putting Danny to bed, my phone buzzed. It was Mike. "Hey, how's Danny doing?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual tenderness. "He's better, still recovering," I replied, hoping to stir some emotion in him. "Work's crazy here," he said, sounding distracted. I sat down in the living room, the silence engulfing me. "Mike, we barely talk these days. Is everything okay with you? You seem different." There was a pause on the line. "Different? No, I'm just really busy, Irene. You know how it is starting up a new branch." I tried to keep the conversation going, to bridge the growing gap. "I understand you're busy, but it feels like you're not just physically away. It's like I don't know you anymore." He let out a sigh. "Irene, you're overthinking it. It's just stress, that's all. Once things settle down here, it'll be better." But his reassurances did little to ease my growing concerns. His words felt empty, devoid of the connection we once shared. Weeks passed, and Mike's brief return home did little to quell my fears. He was physically present, but emotionally distant. He spent most of his time either working on his laptop or engrossed in his phone. One night, I decided to confront him. Mike, we need to talk. You've been distant ever since you took this new job. Is there something you're not telling me? He looked up from his phone, his expression a mix of annoyance and surprise. Irene, why do you keep saying that? I'm right here. But you're not really. You're always on your phone or laptop. It's like you're here, but your mind is somewhere else, I said, my voice tinged with frustration. Mike closed his laptop with a sigh. Look, Irene, I've got a lot on my plate right now. The new branch, the pressures from your dad, it's a lot to handle. I'm just trying to do my best. I nodded, trying to understand. I get that, Mike, but we're a team, remember? If there's something bothering you, you can talk to me. He shook his head, a half smile on his face. There's nothing to talk about, Irene. I'm just busy, that's all. You're making a big deal out of nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like a chasm was forming between us, one that I couldn't bridge, no matter how hard I tried. The day started routinely enough, with the familiar hum of my computer and the soft breathing of Danny during his nap. I was deep in thought, maneuvering through the complexities of a web design project, when a knock at the door jolted me back to reality. Opening it, I found myself face to face with a stranger, his eyes weary yet determined. Can I help you? I asked, curiosity mingling with a hint of apprehension. Yes, you're Irene, Mike's wife, right? I'm David. His voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of nervousness. I nodded, still unsure where this was going. That's me. What is this about? David took a deep breath, as if bracing himself. I believe your husband, Mike, is having an affair with my wife. His words hit me like a ton of bricks. That's impossible, I stammered, disbelief clouding my thoughts. Mike wouldn't do that. There's got to be some mistake. I thought the same at first, David admitted, reaching into his pocket. But then I found this. He handed me his phone, his hand shaking slightly. The photos displayed on the screen were heart-wrenching. There was Mike, undeniably him, in a series of intimate moments with a woman I didn't recognize. They were laughing, embracing, their closeness leaving no room for doubt. I felt my world spin as I handed back the phone. Why are you showing me this? My voice cracked, barely a whisper under the weight of my crumbling reality. David's gaze was sympathetic yet firm. Because you deserve to know the truth. And I think we should do something about it. A mixture of emotions surged through me, anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of loss. What do you mean, do something about it? He leaned against the door frame, his posture suggesting a man who had nothing left to lose. I have a plan. A way to confront them, to bring this out into the open. I can't just let this go, and I don't think you should either. My mind raced. Part of me wanted to shut the door and pretend this never happened, but another, stronger part knew I couldn't live with the uncertainty. What kind of plan? We need more evidence, something undeniable. I propose we catch them together, in the act, David explained, his voice laced with a mix of pain and resolve. The idea was daunting, yet it resonated with the part of me that craved closure. How would we do that? I know where and when they meet. If you're willing, we can confront them, together, he proposed, his eyes searching mine for a decision. The thought of facing Mike in such a scenario was terrifying, yet the need for the truth, for some semblance of control in the chaos, was overpowering. Okay, I'm in. I need to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As David left, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of the decision I had just made. The path ahead was fraught with pain and uncertainty, but I knew there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and I had to face it, for my sake and for Danny's. The reality of what David and I were about to do hit me as we sat in the dimly lit apartment next door to Mike's. We were there to unveil the truth, using the thin walls to our advantage. The apartment, ironically provided by my father's company for Mike, was now the stage for uncovering his betrayal. David was setting up a small recording device, his hands steady but his eyes betraying a storm of emotions. "Can't believe it's come to this," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. "Neither can I. But we need to know, right?" As we waited, the silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and questions. Then, the sound of a door opening next door broke the stillness. My heart skipped a beat, and I saw David tense up. "That's them," he said, his voice barely a whisper. We moved closer to the wall, straining to hear. The voices were muffled at first, but then clearer. It was Mike, his laughter unmistakable, mingling with a woman's voice, his mistress. I clenched my fists, fighting back a surge of emotions. The intimacy in their voices was like a knife twisting in my heart. "Are you getting this?" David asked, his voice tight with anger. I nodded, holding the recorder close to the wall. "Yes, it's all being recorded." The sounds from the other side of the wall continued, laughter, conversation, and then unmistakably more intimate noises. It was excruciating to sit there, hearing Mike betray our family so blatantly. But amid the heartache, there was a growing sense of resolve. We were gathering the evidence we needed, undeniable proof of their betrayal. After what felt like an eternity, the noises ceased, and a heavy silence fell over our makeshift surveillance spot. David and I exchanged a look, a mix of sorrow and determination in our eyes. "We have what we need," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Now we confront them." David nodded, his jaw set. "Let's do it now. No point waiting." As we stood up, I felt a strange sense of empowerment mixed with dread. The life I had known with Mike was over, and confronting him was the first step into a new, uncertain future. "We need to catch them off guard," David said as we moved toward the door. I agreed, clutching the recorder like a lifeline. "Let's go. It's time they faced the consequences." Stepping out of the apartment, the weight of the moment settled on my shoulders. We were about to face the people who had turned our lives upside down. The confrontation would be painful, but necessary. David and I stood in the dimly lit corridor outside Mike's apartment, our hearts racing with a mix of anxiety and determination. The plan was simple, but bold. David would pretend to be a courier, a ruse to ensure Mike would open the door. David knocked firmly, announcing loudly enough to be heard through the door, "Delivery." We heard footsteps approaching from inside. The door swung open, and there stood Mike, his face transitioning from annoyance to shock as his eyes landed on me. "Irene? What the hell are you doing here?" I took a deep breath, my voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil inside. "We need to talk, Mike. Can I come in?" Behind Mike, the mistress, a young woman with a startled expression, stood frozen. Reluctantly, Mike stepped aside, allowing us entry. The room felt tense, charged with unspoken accusations and fear. Without mincing words, David confronted Mike. "We know about the affair, Mike. You can drop the act." Mike's reaction was a mix of defensiveness and scorn. This is nothing. She seduced me. I was just caught up." His mistress, now visibly shaken, retorted, "What? No, you were as much in this as I was." Ignoring her, Mike turned to me, trying to downplay the situation. "Irene, listen, this isn't what it looks like." I couldn't hold back any longer. "Not what it looks like?" "I heard everything, Mike. We have recordings." Mike glanced at the recording device in David's hand, his face turning pale. "Recordings? Irene, you've got to understand." "There's nothing to understand," I cut him off, my voice rising in anger. "You betrayed our family, Mike. You betrayed me and Danny." He started to say something but stopped, realizing the gravity of his situation. "Irene, please, Mike's voice trailed off as he fell to his knees, a pathetic figure of desperation. "Forgive me, I made a mistake. Please, don't tell your father about this." I looked down at him, feeling a mix of pity and revulsion. "You think I can just forgive and forget? I'm going to demand compensation for this betrayal. And yes, I will tell my father. He deserves to know the kind of man you really are." Mike's face crumpled in despair, but there was no going back. The trust we had was shattered beyond repair. David, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "You're going to pay for this, Mike. Both of you." The mistress, now crying, looked completely overwhelmed. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." As we left the apartment, leaving Mike and his mistress to their own messy reality, I felt a strange sense of closure. It was painful and heart-wrenching, but necessary. The confrontation was over, and with it, a chapter of my life had ended. Stepping out into the brisk evening air, the weight of what had just transpired in Mike's apartment hung heavily over me. David and I walked in silence to a nearby park bench. The noise of the city around us felt distant, muffled by the shock and turmoil churning inside. David was the first to break the silence. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Irene. But at least now you know the truth." I nodded, feeling numb. "Yes, the truth." I paused, gathering my thoughts. "What are you going to do now?" He looked down, his hands clenched tightly. "I need to think. There's a lot to process. But one thing is clear, I can't stay with her after this." "I understand," I said softly. The reality of my own situation was beginning to sink in. I need to start planning for a life without Mike. For Danny's sake. David looked at me, empathy in his eyes. "If you need anything, any help, just let me know." I managed a weak smile. "Thank you, David. I appreciate it." We sat there for a while longer, lost in our own thoughts, before parting ways. As I walked back to my parents' house, where Danny was staying, the magnitude of the situation hit me. My marriage was over, and the life I had known was shattered. When I arrived, my parents immediately sensed something was wrong. "Irene, what happened? You look upset," my mom asked, concern etched on her face. I sighed, not sure where to begin. "Mom, Dad, I found out Mike has been having an affair." The room went silent. My dad's expression hardened. "Are you sure?" I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "Yes, I'm sure. I heard them, and I have recordings." My mom reached out, taking my hand. "Oh, Irene, I'm so sorry. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to file for divorce," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "I can't be with him after this. It's over." My dad, always the protector, spoke up. "He won't get away with this. I'll make sure of that. And you and Danny will always have a home here." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, grateful for their support. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you both." The final chapter of my marriage to Mike was written in a lawyer's office, amidst a sea of paperwork and legal jargon. The divorce process was grueling but necessary. I fought hard, with my lawyer by my side, to ensure that Danny and I would have the financial security we needed. The court granted me alimony and compensation for Mike's betrayal, a small solace in the wake of our shattered life. Meanwhile, David, the man who had been thrust into my life by our shared misfortune, also finalized his divorce. His wife, once living a life of luxury, now faced a starkly different reality. She had to trade her affluent lifestyle for a job as a saleswoman in a retail store, a harsh consequence of her actions. As for Mike, the repercussions of his infidelity were far-reaching. My father, once a mentor and supporter, was ruthless in his response. He not only fired Mike from the company, but also made it clear that he would use his influence to prevent Mike from securing a position in any reputable firm. The man who once had a promising career now juggled two menial jobs, struggling to make ends meet. Life after the divorce was a journey of healing and rediscovery for me. I focused on raising Danny, ensuring that the upheaval in our lives didn't dim his bright, innocent spirit. Watching him grow, laugh, and explore the world was a balm to my bruised heart. My work as a web designer provided not just a financial lifeline but also a welcome distraction. I threw myself into my projects, finding joy and fulfillment in creating and designing. It was a reminder that despite the chaos, I still had control over some aspects of my life. My parents were my rock during this time. They provided unwavering support, offering a safe haven for Danny and me. "You're stronger than you realize, Irene," my dad would often say. And as time passed, I began to believe him. In the quiet moments, often after I had put Danny to bed, I would reflect on the tumultuous journey. The pain of betrayal still lingered, but it was slowly being replaced by a newfound strength and independence. I had navigated through the darkest of times and emerged on the other side, not unscathed, but certainly stronger. As I closed the chapter on a painful part of my life, I opened a new one, filled with possibilities and the promise of a fresh start. My journey was not over, it was merely taking a new path, one that I was ready to travel with hope and determination. I'm Clara, a 40-year-old French teacher. Life was pretty standard, filled with books, classes, and the occasional coffee with friends. I never expected it to take a dramatic turn until Mrs. Lefevre, an old friend of my mother's, decided to play matchmaker. One afternoon, while I was sipping tea at my mother's house, Mrs. Lefevre dropped by. She was a lively woman in her 60s, always with a story to tell or a plan up her sleeve. "Clara, dear, I have the perfect man for you," she exclaimed as she settled into the armchair. I chuckled, a bit skeptical. "Really, Mrs. Lefevre? And who might this perfect man be?" She leaned in, her eyes twinkling with excitement. "My son, David. He's a widower, a wonderful father to 2 teenagers. I think you two would hit it off." I hesitated, the idea of stepping into a ready-made family seemed daunting. "I don't know, Mrs. Lefevre. Stepping into a family, it's a lot." She waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense. You're a warm, loving person. And David is such a caring man. Plus, the kids are lovely, really." My mother, who had been listening quietly, joined in. "Clara, it wouldn't hurt to meet him. You never know what life has in store for you." Encouraged by their enthusiasm, I agreed. A meeting was set up at a local cafe the following week. The day arrived, and I found myself sitting across from David, a man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. We talked about everything, from our jobs to our hobbies. He was a civil engineer and loved hiking, while I shared stories about my teaching and my love for French literature. "Your mom tells me you're a fantastic teacher," David said, smiling warmly. I blushed slightly. "Well, I love my job. Teaching French is my passion. And your mom mentioned you're quite the hiker." He laughed. "Yeah, when I get the chance. But with Sophie and Max, my free time is usually spent on more family-oriented activities." The way he spoke about his children, Sophie and Max, was endearing. They were 14 and 12, stepping into the challenging teenage years. "We all have our hands full with teenagers, don't we?" I joked, thinking of my rowdy students. By the time we finished our coffees, I felt a connection with David, a sense of understanding and mutual respect. We agreed to meet again, and I found myself looking forward to it. After David and I got married, life settled into a comfortable routine that I cherished deeply. The addition of Sophie and Max, David's children, into my life was a source of joy, filling a gap I didn't know existed. I loved being a part of their lives, even though they never called me mom. The bond we shared was unique and special in its own way. One lazy Sunday afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen, baking cookies with Sophie. The air was filled with the sweet aroma of chocolate and vanilla. "Clara, do you think these cookies will turn out okay?" "I'm not very good at this," Sophie said, a hint of doubt in her voice as she mixed the dough. I smiled at her. "You're doing great, Sophie. Baking is like learning a new language. It takes a little practice, but you'll get the hang of it." Sophie beamed, her confidence boosted. "Thanks, Clara. It's fun baking with you." Just then, Max bounded into the kitchen, his energy almost palpable. "What's cooking, ladies?" "It smells awesome. We're making cookies. Want to help us with the decorations later?" I asked, knowing his creative flair would add a fun element to our baking. Max nodded enthusiastically. "Sure. I'll make them look super cool." The afternoon passed with laughter and light-hearted banter. It was moments like these that made our house a home. Later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, the conversation turned to our plans for the upcoming holiday. "How about we go hiking this year? There are some great trails not far from here," David suggested, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Sophie seemed intrigued. "Can we camp overnight?" "I've always wanted to try that." Max chimed in, "Yeah, and maybe do some fishing too." I watched the animated discussion, feeling a warm sense of belonging. "That sounds like a great idea. A little adventure for the family," I added. David reached across the table, giving my hand a gentle squeeze. "Thanks for being so open to this, Clara. I know outdoor stuff isn't really your thing." I laughed. "Well, I might not be the outdoorsy type, but I'm definitely up for new experiences. Especially with you all." The dinner continued with plans and ideas being tossed around, each of us contributing to the holiday itinerary. It was a simple meal, but the warmth and love that filled the room made it memorable. That night, as David and I cleaned up the kitchen, he turned to me, his expression soft. "Clara, I just want to say, you've been amazing with the kids. They've really opened up to you." I leaned against the counter, a contented sigh escaping my lips. "I love them, David. They're great kids, and I just want to be there for them, in whatever way they need." He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close. In that embrace, I felt the strength of our family bond. It was a bond that had grown over shared experiences, mutual respect, and love. I went to bed that night feeling grateful and fulfilled. Shortly after our wedding, David's mother, Mrs. Lefevre, suffered a stroke that left her paralyzed. In the blink of an eye, our lives changed drastically. I took on the responsibility of caring for her, balancing this new role with my job as a French teacher and managing household chores. These were challenging times, but I found solace in providing comfort to someone who had welcomed me with open arms into their family. Years passed, and Mrs. Lefevre's health continued to decline. Then, one fateful morning, she passed away. The loss hit me harder than I expected. She had become like a second mother to me. The day after her passing, the house was quiet, an eerie calm that felt unnatural. I was in the kitchen, lost in my thoughts, when David and the kids came in. Their expressions were solemn, but there was a strange undercurrent of anticipation in their voices. "Mom's lawyer will be here this afternoon to discuss the will," David said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Sophie chimed in, her tone surprisingly light. "I wonder what Grandma left for us. She always said she had some savings aside." I was taken aback by their conversation. Shouldn't we be focusing on arranging a proper service for her? She was a big part of this family. David shrugged. "We'll take care of that, but there's no harm in looking ahead, Clara. Mom would have wanted us to." As the day progressed, their excitement over the inheritance became more apparent. It was as though Mrs. Lefevre's passing was merely a pathway to financial gain. I couldn't help but feel disturbed by this blatant display of greed. That evening, after the lawyer's visit, David and the kids gathered in the living room, eagerly discussing the inheritance. I stood at the doorway, listening to them. So, we're getting a good amount, then? Max asked, his eyes gleaming. David nodded. Yes, enough to make some significant changes around here. Sophie's laughter filled the room. Finally, I can get that new laptop I wanted. I stepped into the room, unable to contain my disappointment. Is this really what's important right now? Your mother just passed away. David looked at me, his expression cold. Clara, you wouldn't understand. This is family stuff. I felt a sting at his words. I cared for your mother for years, David. How can you say I wouldn't understand? He scoffed, turning away. Just because you looked after her doesn't mean you're entitled to anything. You did what any decent person would do. In the weeks that followed, David and the kids became increasingly distant and dismissive. Their attitude towards me changed from indifference to outright rudeness. David's remarks became more cutting, and the children, following his lead, treated me with a lack of respect that I had never experienced before. One evening, as I was setting the dinner table, David walked in, his face stern. Clara, you need to step up your game around here. The house has been a mess lately. I looked around, bewildered. The house was as tidy as it always was. I've been doing my best, David. I don't understand what's changed. He shrugged, his voice harsh. Just saying, you could do better. After all, it's not like you're contributing much else around here. I felt a lump form in my throat. The man I had married, the family I had embraced, were now treating me like an outsider, an unwelcome burden. The shift in my family's demeanor after Mrs. Lefebvre's passing wasn't gradual, but a sudden plunge into a cold, unfeeling world. David and the children's behavior towards me transformed overnight from distant to openly hostile. Every day brought a new barrage of insults and nagging, and I was treated less like a family member and more like an unwelcome servant. One particularly harsh evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, David entered the kitchen, his face twisted in a sneer. Clara, why is dinner not ready yet? You really can't do anything right, can you? Stunned by his harsh tone, I replied, trying to keep my composure. I'm doing the best I can, David. Dinner will be ready in a few minutes. He scoffed, looking around with disdain. You know, I only tolerated you because you were useful, taking care of my mother and the kids. But now? You're just a burden. His words cut through me like a knife. I stood there, the plates in my hand feeling heavier than ever. Sophie walked in, her voice dripping with contempt. Yeah, Clara, you should be grateful we even let you stay here. You're just a scary, old, and useless woman. Max, not to be outdone by his sister, chimed in mockingly, yeah, who would want you around? You're like a ghost haunting this house. Every word was a blow to my spirit. I had dedicated years of my life to this family, caring for them as my own, only to be reduced to this pitiful state. I served dinner in silence, their cruel laughter and jibes echoing around me. That night, as I lay in my bed, the day's events replayed in my mind. David's cruel declaration that I was nothing more than a now useless caretaker, Sophie's and Max's hurtful comments, it all hammered home the painful reality that the family I had loved and cared for saw me as nothing more than an expendable servant. The following days were no better. Every task I did was met with criticism and disdain. I was constantly reminded of my place in the household, a place that seemed to have no respect or kindness. One afternoon, as I was cleaning the living room, David walked in with a look of annoyance. Clara, have you seen my blue tie? I can't seem to find it anywhere. I washed and hung it in your closet yesterday, David, I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. Well, it's not there now. Can't you do anything right? You're just taking up space in this house, he snapped, storming off. I finished my cleaning, each sweep of the broom feeling heavier with the burden of his words. The home I once cherished now felt like a prison, filled with contempt and scorn. Living in a constant state of belittlement and disrespect had taken its toll on me. Each day in David's house was a battle against his and the children's growing cruelty. I began to contemplate the painful decision of leaving, but my worsening leg pain and the lack of financial resources made me feel trapped. One chilly morning, as I limped around the kitchen, preparing breakfast, David stormed in, his face twisted in annoyance. "Clara, why is everything taking so long? You're moving like a snail." I tried to hide my pain. "My legs aren't what they used to be, David. I'm moving as fast as I can." He rolled his eyes. "Excuses, always excuses. You're just a burden, you know that?" The words stung, but I remained silent, focusing on setting the breakfast table. Sophie and Max entered the kitchen, their expressions mirroring their father's impatience. "Ugh, why do we always have to wait for Clara? She's useless," Sophie muttered, sitting down with a huff. Max didn't bother to hide his disdain. "Yeah, if she can't even make breakfast properly, what good is she?" I served them breakfast, each word from them like a dagger to my heart. As they ate, I sat down at the far end of the table, my appetite gone. After breakfast, I retreated to my room, the pain in my legs growing with each step. The lack of empathy and the constant insults from David and the kids were unbearable. I sat on the edge of my bed, the reality of my situation sinking in. I needed to leave, but I was scared and unsure of how to proceed. Later that day, I mustered the courage to speak to David. I found him in the living room, reading a newspaper. "David, can we talk?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He glanced up, his expression one of irritation. "What is it now, Clara?" "I've been thinking, maybe it's best if I leave. I don't feel welcome here anymore," I said, my voice shaking. David looked at me, a smirk forming on his lips. "Leave? And go where? You have no money, no place to go. Your mother died without leaving you anything to inherit. You're stuck here, Clara, whether you like it or not." His words were a harsh reminder of my dire situation. I felt a sense of despair wash over me. He was right, I had nowhere to go. My job as a teacher had been my only source of income, and with my leg condition, I couldn't even do that anymore. I had to resign from school. It was a bitter, but the only right decision. The following days were a blur of household chores, nagging, and insults. David and the kids treated me with utter disregard, their words and actions reinforcing the painful truth that I was no longer a part of this family, but a mere inconvenience to them. As I struggled with my pain and loneliness, I began to secretly plan my escape. I started saving whatever little money I could, hiding it away for the day I could finally leave. The thought of freedom, of being away from the constant belittling and disrespect, was the only thing that kept me going. One afternoon, while David and the kids were out, I sat at my old laptop, nursing my aching legs. Browsing aimlessly, I discovered a website for online tutoring. A thought struck me: could I leverage my skills as a French teacher in a new, virtual setting? Hesitant, but driven by a newfound purpose, I set up a profile on the site. "Experienced French teacher available for online lessons," I typed, my heart racing with both nervousness and excitement. The next few days were a whirlwind. To my amazement, requests for lessons began to pour in. My afternoons, once filled with loneliness and despair, were now occupied with teaching French to eager students from around the world. One day, as I finished a lesson, Sophie walked in, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the laptop. "What are you doing?" she asked suspiciously. "I'm teaching French online." "It's something I'm good at," I replied, trying to keep the defensiveness out of my voice. She scoffed. "As if anyone would want to learn from you." I ignored her remark, feeling a sense of pride in my small, but significant accomplishment. As weeks turned into months, my reputation as an online French tutor grew. I started earning enough to entertain the idea of independence, of a life away from the constant degradation I faced at home. The days that followed saw me juggling my newfound career with the household chores. Despite the physical pain and the emotional drain of living in a hostile environment, I found solace and strength in my teaching. Each lesson I gave was a step closer to freedom, a reminder that I was capable, valuable, and deserving of respect. The tension in the house reached its zenith the evening David announced his promotion at work. That night at dinner, the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. David, Sophie, and Max were unusually chatty, their voices laced with a smug satisfaction that sent a chill down my spine. As I served dinner, trying to ignore the dull ache in my legs, David cleared his throat, ready to make his announcement. "I've got some news. I got a promotion at work. With it, I bought a new house. Bigger, better, and it suits our new status." Sophie clapped her hands in delight. "That's amazing, Dad. When do we move?" David's gaze shifted to me, cold and calculating. "We will be moving soon. But Clara won't be joining us." The room went silent. I looked up, my heart sinking. "What do you mean, David?" He smirked, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "You're not coming, Clara. You don't belong in that part of our lives. You were useful once, but not anymore." Sophie joined in, her voice dripping with disdain. "Yeah, Clara. You're just an old, limping woman. What use would you be in our new house?" Max laughed, adding insult to injury. "You should be grateful we let you stay here this long." I stood there, the plates in my hands trembling. The pain of their words was sharper than any physical ache I had ever felt. David slid the divorce papers across the table to me. "I think it's best we part ways. You can stay here until the house is sold." Numb, I picked up the papers. My hands were shaking as I signed them. There was no point in arguing or pleading. The people I had once called family had shown their true colors, and they were ugly and cruel. The next morning, I began to put my plan into action. While David and the kids were out, I packed my belongings. Each item I placed in the suitcase was a step towards my freedom. When David and the kids returned, they found me at the door, suitcase in hand. David's expression was one of surprise and confusion. "What are you doing, Clara?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of concern. I straightened my back, facing them with a newfound strength. "I'm leaving, David. I will not stay here and be treated like a worthless burden." David scoffed. "Where will you go? You have nothing." I smiled, the first genuine smile in weeks. "I have more than you think. I have my dignity, my skills, and I have plans. You will not see me begging." In my rented apartment, a modest but serene space, I was rebuilding my life, one online French lesson at a time. The freedom and tranquility here were in stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere I had escaped from. One evening, as I was reviewing lesson plans, my phone erupted with the frantic ringing of a call from David. His voice, laced with panic and anger, filled the room. "Clara, what the hell have you done? Sending those recordings to my boss? Do you have any idea what you've caused?" he bellowed, the sound of his fury resonating through the phone. I leaned back in my chair, a smirk playing on my lips. "Oh, you mean the recordings of all the lovely things you and the kids said to me?" "Yes, I did send them." In the background, I could hear the unmistakable cries of Max and Sophie. "Tell her to fix this, Dad. She's ruined everything." David's voice cracked with desperation. "Clara, please. Because of those recordings, I'd been demoted. I can't afford the mortgage on the new house. You have to help us." The sounds of their pleading were music to my ears. "Help you? After the way you all treated me? You made your bed, David. Now lie in it." His voice rose to a near scream. "You can't do this to us. We're your family." I laughed, a deep, hearty sound that felt liberating. "Family? No, family doesn't treat each other the way you treated me. You and your kids were nothing but cruel and abusive. This is your karma, David. Sophie's voice cut through, shrill and pleading. Clara, please. We didn't mean any of it. We'll change, I swear. Max joined in, his voice laced with fear. Yeah, Clara, please. We're sorry. We need you. I stood up, pacing the room as I replied, sorry? Your words and actions broke me. But guess what? I picked up the pieces and put myself back together. Without you, I owe you nothing. David's voice was a mix of rage and helplessness. You're going to let us lose everything? I stopped pacing, standing tall and proud. Yes, David, I am. You and the kids have made your bed, and now you get to sleep in it. Goodbye. I hung up the phone, a sense of satisfaction washing over me. I had stood up to them, not with malice, but with the strength they never thought I had. Over the following weeks, I heard from mutual friends that David and the kids were struggling. They couldn't pay the mortgage, and the bank had taken over the house. They were forced to move into a small rented apartment, and both Sophie and Max had to take up jobs to help make ends meet. As for me, my online tutoring was flourishing. I was saving money, not just for my day-to-day needs, but for a house of my own. A place where I could live in peace, away from the shadows of my past.